The ventway went quiet, and Watch Officer Thren knew exactly what that meant. She had run the low Warren monitors on Coriol Anchorage for 6 cycles, and she had learned to read the station the way a fisher reads a tide line. There was always sound down there. The old atmospherics groaned. Coolant ticked in the exchanger runs. Rats that weren't rats, little pale scavengers the freighters brought in scratched behind the plating. When all of that stopped at once, when the audio bars on her console fell flat across an entire junction, it did not mean the station had gone to sleep. It meant something down there had gone to work. "Junction 9's dark," she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that later when she remembered it. Audio and thermal both. "Pull the drone." The drone was a squat 6-legged thing, a maintenance crawler the containment office had bolted a camera to and sent into the Warrens because no one else would go. On her screen it trundled around a coolant elbow lamp, throwing a cone of white down a corridor of sweating metal. The feed was clean. The corridor was empty. It was always empty. That was the trick of it. "Bring it back to the last warm reading," said the officer beside her, a young Orin named Sull, all nervous joints and too many hands. "It bedded down at the 9 elbow, if it's still there." "It is not still there," Thren said. She had been about to say more. She never got the chance, because on the screen the corridor was no longer empty, and there was no moment in between. One frame the lamp lit bare plate. The next it lit a wall of ash gray that had not walked into the light so much as the light had discovered it already arrived. No eyes caught the beam. That was the part that undid people. Everything living through an Ishin, and this through nothing, drank the lamp whole, a hole cut in the shape of a thing. The feed jumped, tumbled, showed ceiling, showed floor. Then it showed the flat gray of a dead channel. Sull made a sound with 3 of his mouths. Thren logged the loss of the unit in a calm hand, the way she had logged the loss of the 4 before it, and keyed the incident to the containment prefect's queue, and did not look at the empty corridor of her own console for a while. 2 years the station had lived with this. 2 years since the thing came aboard in a survey pod out of the deep dark, a juvenile then, small enough to fit in a specimen crate, tagged and numbered and scheduled for a quiet death that had never happened. Specimen 6, the manifest called it. The dock crews called it the hollow, because that was what the vents went before it moved, hollow, breathless, the sound of a held breath in 10,000 meters of ducting. You did not hunt it. They had tried hunting it. You did not gas the Warrens, because the Warrens were the station's lungs, and you would kill the 80,000 souls in the ring long before you inconvenienced the thing in the walls. You did not send the Drael war beasts down after it, because the Drael war beasts had been down after it exactly once, and the Drael did not speak of that, and there were 3 fewer war beasts on the station roster and no bodies to grieve over. You lived with it. You closed the lower Warrens to solo traffic, and you sent your drones to die, and you told yourself it kept to the dark and asked for nothing, and mostly that was true. Thren filed her report. At the bottom in the notes field, she wrote what she always wrote, because it was the only honest thing to write. Location unknown, intent unknown, recommend no pursuit. She was wrong about one of those 3, though she would not learn how wrong for another 11 days. The thing in the walls was not, at that moment, unlocatable. It was moving with great patience through a coolant chase toward the residential spur on Deck 14, and its intent was not unknown at all. It was going to see the boy again. Calmero did not know he was the most watched creature on Coriol Anchorage, and if someone had told him, he would have shrugged and gone back to his heat exchanger. He was on his back under the Deck 14 atmospherics manifold with a light clamped between his teeth and both arms buried to the elbow, in a junction that 3 certified Orin engineers had refused to touch, and he was humming. It was an old tune, one his grandmother had hummed over a sink a very long way from here, and it had no words he remembered, and it filled the crawl space with a small human sound. The manifold was fighting him. A regulator valve had crystallized shut. the way they did in the cold runs, and the fix was to warm it and work it and warm it and work it and not lose your temper, because the valve did not care about your temper. Cal had a great deal of not losing his temper. His supervisor had once written on a performance review in a tone that could not decide whether it was praising or diagnosing him, the applicant's principal professional characteristic. He warmed the valve. He worked it. Somewhere above and behind him, past the grill that vented this crawlspace into the return chase, something shifted its weight. Cal heard it. Of course he heard it. A person who spends his shifts alone in the bones of a station learns its sounds the way he learns his own breathing, and this sound was not the station's. It was too deliberate. It had settled, not fallen, and it had settled close. He did not stop humming. That was the thing the aliens could never get their heads around later when it mattered. They kept asking him, in their various ways, why he had not run, why he had not signaled, why, when the deadliest predator any of them had catalogued in a generation had come and lain down 4 meters from his unprotected back, a young human with no weapon and no armor and no sense the conquered could locate had simply kept working. The truth was not brave, and it was not clever. The truth was that Cal had grown up on a hard-luck agricultural world where the woods came right up to the fence line, and the woods had things in them, and his father had taught him the first rule before he taught him to read. You do not run from what is bigger than you. Running is a language, and the only word it knows is pray. You keep your hands slow and your voice low, and you finish what you were doing, and you let the big thing decide it has better places to be. The big thing, this time, did not decide it had better places to be, but it did not do anything else either. It lay in the dark of the return chase and it watched Cal warm a valve, and after a while its breathing slowed to match the slow work of his hands, and if either of them found that strange, only one of them was in a position to say so, and he didn't. There, Cal murmured, when the valve finally gave and turned smooth under his fingers. That's better, isn't it? That's better for everyone. He was talking to the valve. He was, in the loose way of a man who works alone, also talking to the dark, and to whatever the dark held because it was there and he was there, and it seemed rude to pretend otherwise. He backed out of the crawlspace on his elbows, gathered his light, and sat up in the corridor with his spine against cold plate. Through the grill of the return chase, at the very edge of where his light reached and stopped, he could see nothing. He looked at the nothing for a moment. The nothing, he was fairly sure, looked back. "Good night," Cal said, and clipped his light to his belt and went home. Behind the grill, the dark held its breath a while longer, and then, without a sound, it was empty. Coryell anchorage hung in a slow orbit around the ochre gas giant Vantive, a wheel of lit metal 90 kilometers across, and it was, by the reckoning of the 7 conquered that ran it, a civilized place. 9 species kept offices in its ring. Its docks turned over 400 hulls a cycle. Its great dorsal viewport, a sweep of crystal a kilometer long, showed the banded gold of the gas giant by day and the hard stars by what the station agreed to call night, and beneath that viewport the concourse markets never fully closed. Cal liked the viewport. He did not like the markets, which were loud and full of species who found his stillness unnerving and told him so with the frankness the conquered mistook for good manners. He liked the viewport at the quiet hour, when the shift bells had emptied it, and he could stand under a kilometer of gold light with a cup of something warm and watch the storms crawl across Vantive's face and feel, for a little while, that the distance between himself and everything he had come from was not a wound but simply a distance. He was there that off-shift when steward Ossiel found him. Ossiel was V-Helk, which meant he stood half again Cal's height on 4 jointed legs, wore his authority in the lacquered chiton of his mantle, and had the unfortunate V-Helk habit of arriving at a conversation already 3 sentences into it. Which is precisely the difficulty, you see, because the incident office has now lost a 5th crawler, and the prefect will want the residential atmospherics certified as clear, and you are the only technician who will sign a low warrant certification, and I find that I must ask you a question I do not enjoy asking." "Evening, steward," Cal said. Osceola stopped. His mantle plates ticked, which was the V-Helk equivalent of drawing a breath. "Yes, evening." "Marrow, how often are you alone in the warrants?" "Every shift." "On deck 14. "That's my run. 14 through 19, the cold spur." Cal sipped his drink. "Somebody's got to keep the air moving down there, steward. It doesn't move itself." Osceola's eye cluster tracked him with an attention Cal found unusual even for a V-Helk. "You are aware of the standing order. No solo traffic below deck 12. "I'm aware there's an order. I'm also aware that if I follow it, the return air on the residential decks goes stale in about 9 days, and then 80,000 people start getting headaches, and then somebody senior asks a technician to go fix it, and the only technician who'll go alone is me." He said it without heat. It was not a complaint. It was a schedule. "So mostly, I don't read that order too closely." "You should read it very closely," Osceola said. "Because for 2 years, the reason we lose crawlers below deck 12 and not technicians is that we send crawlers below deck 12 and not technicians. And you have been sending yourself." Cal turned that over. He was not a stupid young man, whatever the concourse thought of a person who moved slowly and spoke less. He knew what lived in the warrens. Everyone knew. He had known it was there tonight, 4 meters off his spine, breathing in the dark. "It hasn't bothered me," he said. "It has killed maintenance drones for 2 years, Osceola said, "and it killed 3 Drail war beasts in an afternoon, and there are dock crew who went below 12 on a dare in the early days who did not come back up, and the incident office does not put their names on the boards because the incident office does not have anything to put in a coffin, and you tell me it has not bothered you." The steward's plates ticked again, faster. "Marrow, it has not bothered you because it is deciding something about you. Predators of that grade do not tolerate. They assess. If it has left you alone, it is because it has not yet finished looking." Cal watched a storm the size of a continent turn over on the face of Vantith. "All right," he said. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to stop going down alone." "And the air?" Osceola was quiet a moment. He was, whatever else, an honest administrator, and honest administrators arrive eventually at the sentence they came to avoid. "The air," he admitted, "is the difficulty." "Yeah," Cal said, "it usually is." He finished his drink. Above them, the gold light of the gas giant poured down through a kilometer of crystal and lit the two of them, the tall, anxious steward and the small, still human, and made long, soft shadows across the empty concourse. "I'll be careful," Cal said, which was not a promise to stop, and both of them knew it. The next 11 days, the watching changed. Cal noticed it the way you notice weather turning, not one moment but an accumulation, a series of small wrongnesses that added up to a front moving in. He would come off shift to find his tool roll recoiled, the wrenches nested in an order that was not his order but was, he had to admit, a better order. He would leave a warm exchanger room and come back an hour later to find the deck plate in front of the vent grill scored with fine parallel lines, the way a cat scores a post, 4 of them, patient, deliberate. On the 6th day, he found the offering. He came around the elbow at Junction 9, the junction where the drones went to die, and there on the walkway grating, laid out with a care that made the back of his neck prickle, was a station scavenger, one of the pale freighter rats, grown fat down here in the dark. It was dead. It was not torn. It had been killed with a precision that left it almost whole, and it had been placed squarely in the center of the walkway, where a human coming around the elbow could not fail to see it. Cal crouched over it for a long time. He was not a superstitious man, but he had kept enough animals to know what he was looking at, and what he was looking at was not a warning. A warning is left where you'll step in it. This was left where you'd find it, face up, presented. On the farm, when the barn cat wanted to be thought well of, it left things on the step exactly like this. Small deaths, offered up, laid at the door of the one it had decided the household belonged to. "You didn't have to do that," Cal said quietly, to the dark past the grill. The dark did not answer, but it was there. He could feel the weight of it, the specific gravity of being looked at, and for the first time in 11 days it did not feel like assessment. It felt like waiting. He did not eat the rat, obviously, but he did not kick it aside either. He moved it with 2 fingers to the little ledge under the grill where the dark could take it back if it wanted, and he said, "Thank you," because his grandmother had raised him to say thank you when something gave him a gift, even a terrible one, even one he hadn't asked for. Then he went and warmed the exchanger room 5 degrees past regulation, the way he'd been doing for months without ever quite admitting to himself why, so that whatever slept in the walls of the cold spur would have one warm place to sleep, and he logged the extra draw as a valve in efficiency, and he went home. He was learning something the whole station had failed to learn in 2 years, and he did not have the words for it yet, and it would be days before anyone made him say it out loud in a room full of frightened aliens. The thing in the walls was not hunting him. It was courting him. On deck 14 in the residential spur, Cal's quarters were a box, a bunk, a locker, a fold-down table, a viewport the size of a dinner plate that looked out on nothing but the curve of the station's own hull. It was small even by the standards of a junior technician, and Cal kept it clean and spare, the way a man keeps a place he does not expect anyone to visit. He was 3 nights past the offering, sitting on the edge of the bunk pulling off his boots, when someone knocked on the door. He froze with one boot in his hand. It was not the chime. The station had a chime, a polite 2-note thing the Concord had installed on every hatch so that visitors could announce themselves without the barbarism of striking another being's home with their fist. No one Cal knew ever used the chime. His neighbors were an Orin family who signaled with a wrapped knuckle, and a shiftmate who thumped the panel flat-palmed and hollered his name. This was neither. This was 3 impacts, low on the hatch near the floor. They were spaced with a patience that no hand delivers, a beat, a beat, a beat, heavy and soft at once, the sound of something that could have gone through the door choosing instead to touch it. The hatch, which was rated to hold vacuum, flexed very slightly inward on the 3rd. Cal sat with the boot in his hand and understood, all at once and completely, what was standing in the corridor outside his home. He set the boot down. He did not do it quickly. He set it down the way you set down anything when the room has become a room where sudden movement is a decision with consequences, and then he stood in his socks and crossed the 2 steps to the hatch, and he put his hand flat against the cold metal. On the other side, something put its weight against the same metal. He felt it come through the door, not a blow, a lean, the enormous patient pressure of a mass settling against the only thing between them. The hatch was rated for vacuum. It did not so much as creak. But Cal felt, through his palm, the slow tide of another creature's breathing, and he stood there and breathed with it, in the small box of his quarters in his socks, and did not open the door. Not because he was afraid. He examined himself for fear, the way you probe a tooth, and found something stranger, a kind of held stillness, the feeling of being at the edge of a thing that could not be taken back. If he opened the hatch, he understood, some line would be crossed that the whole station had spent 2 years pretending did not exist, and it would be crossed in his name. "You knocked," he said through the door. His voice was low and even. "I heard you, I'm here." The pressure eased. The 3 impacts came again, a beat, a beat, a beat. And this time Cal understood them, because he had heard the exact patience of them before, in a barn on a cold morning, from an old dog too proud to whine, standing at a door it was not sure it was allowed through, asking. He opened the hatch. The corridor light was dim, cycled down for the sleep hours, and for a moment the doorway held nothing but shadow. Then the shadow resolved, the way a thing resolves when your eye finally consents to see it, and Cal Marrow stood face to face with the hollow of Coriol anchorage, and the hollow filled the corridor. It was the size of a plow horse gone low and long, built close to the deck, a coiled architecture of muscle under a hide the flat gray of cold ash. It had no mane, no scales, no visible ears, nothing that caught the light or gave the eye a purchase. Its head was broad and blunt and held level with Cal's chest, and set in it were two eyes that threw back none of the corridor's glow, matte and dark and depthless, and those eyes were fixed on him with an attention so total that it had a physical weight, like a hand laid flat against his sternum. It could have killed him before his nerves finished reporting that the door was open. Every animal instinct Cal owned told him so, plainly, without drama. This was the apex thing. This was the top of every chain it had ever stood in, and it stood now an arm's length away in the doorway of his home, and it did not move. Cal looked at it. He kept his hands loose at his sides and his weight even and his eyes soft, not staring, not challenging, just present, and he let it look at him for as long as it needed. And he said, in the voice he used on frightened valves and skittish machines and once long ago, a colt that had never been touched, "There you are." The hollow's great head lowered. Not in threat, the opposite of threat, the deliberate dropping of the skull below the line of the shoulders that in every predator Cal had ever known meant, in the plainest language a body can speak, that it would not do the thing he was braced for. It took one slow step across the threshold, into the small warm box of his quarters, and the deck plate took its weight without a sound, and it stood in the middle of his floor and looked around at the bunk and the locker and the fold-down table with the frank curiosity of a creature inspecting a den it had already decided to keep. Then it lay down. It folded itself onto Cal's floor with the boneless economy of a cat 400 kilos larger than any cat had a right to be, arranged its limbs, laid its blunt gray head across its forepaws so that its dark, unshining eyes pointed at the door, and let out a long breath that Cal felt in the soles of his feet. It had put itself between Cal and the only entrance. It had made itself the thing that anything coming through that door would have to come through first. Cal stood very still and understood that he had, without meaning to, without paperwork, without the faintest idea how he would ever explain it, acquired the most dangerous animal on Coriol anchorage. Or, more accurately, he understood that it had acquired him, some months ago in the dark, and had spent all this time working up the nerve to knock. "All right," he said softly. He lowered himself to the edge of the bunk slow, and the gray head tracked him the whole way down, but the body did not tense. "All right, you can stay, but we're going to have to talk about the door thing because I can't have you leaning on it. It's the only one I've got." The hollow watched the door. Cal watched the hollow. Somewhere 300 meters up station, in a monitoring suite that never fully slept, a heat signature that the entire containment apparatus of the Southern Concord had failed to locate for 2 years lit up a residential sensor board like a flare, bedded down, stationary, 4 feet from a sleeping human's bunk, and stayed there. Watch Officer Thren was not on shift when it happened, which she would be grateful for and ashamed of in roughly equal measure for a long time afterward. The Orin who was on shift, a night-grade tech named Rhett, saw the thermal bloom appear on the Deck 14 residential board and did exactly what her training told her to do, which was to assume a fire. She dispatched suppression. Suppression arrived, 2 Orin in soft armor with foam lances, and stopped in the corridor outside Unit 14 Green 19, because the corridor outside Unit 14 Green 19 had a smell in it. A cold mineral musk that every species on the station had learned in 2 years to associate with an empty place where a full one used to be. And because the door of 14 Green 19 was shut, and because through the door, faintly, they could hear breathing that was not the breathing of one being. They did not open the door. They were not paid enough to open the door. They backed down the corridor with their foam lances leveled at nothing and called it up the chain, and the chain woke Prefect Olaf Sarn. Olaf Sarn ran containment for Coriol Anchorage, and Olaf Sarn had wanted Specimen 6 dead for 2 years, and Olaf Sarn arrived on deck 1440 minutes later at the head of a hard team, 8 troopers in vacuum-rated shell armor, breech charges, cutting gear, and a pair of stun lances built to drop a drail, with the settled fury of a bureaucrat who has finally, after 2 years, been handed a location. "It has taken a resident," the prefect said. V-Helk mantle plates did not read easily to other species, but a trooper who had served under Sarn a long time could hear the thing under the words, and the thing was not grief. It was vindication. 2 years. 2 years of no pursuit, no gas, no coal, because we could not find it, and now it has found itself a den on my residential deck. Cut the door. Prefect. The team lead was a Drael, a slab of a being named Voss, and the Drael did not spook, but Voss had been in the Warrens the day the war beasts died, and Voss looked at the shut door of 14 Green 19 with the flat care of someone reading a mind. "If it's in there and we cut, we're cutting into a corridor 2 meters wide with the fastest thing any of us has ever seen and a body we can't recover. Recommend we pull the resident's file. See who we're." "The resident is dead, team lead," said Sarn. "The resident has been dead since that heat signature stopped moving. Cut the." The hatch of 14 Green 19 opened from the inside. Every weapon in the corridor came up. 8 stun lances, 2 Drael-rated shockers, the prefect's own sidearm. All of it swung to bear on the widening gap, and in the gap, blinking in the sudden hard light of 8 helmet lamps, stood a young human in his socks and an undershirt, one hand raised flat, palm out, the other holding the door. "Hey," Cal said, "whatever you're about to do, don't, he's asleep." There was a silence in the corridor that had a great many textures in it. "He," said Prefect Olaf Sarn. "Behind me, on the floor, he's asleep, and if 8 of you come through that door in armor, he's going to wake up, and it's going to be very fast, and it's going to be very bad, and none of it is going to be his fault or mine." Cal did not raise his voice. He did not lower the flat of his hand. Under the harsh crossing beams of the helmet lamps he looked exactly like what he was, a tired young man past the middle of his sleep cycle, blinking, unweaponed, entirely calm. "So I'm going to ask all of you to point those somewhere else and back up about 10 meters and let me handle it. Please." "Handle it," Sarn repeated. Behind Cal, in the dark of the quarters, something rose. The troopers did not see it rise so much as they felt the room behind the boy change, the way a cave changes when the thing that lives in it comes forward, and then the ash-gray head slid into the doorway at the level of the human's hip, and 2 matte black eyes took in 8 armored troopers and 2 Drael-killing weapons with an unhurried, comprehensive, and entirely unafraid attention, and the corridor filled with the sound of 8 professionals deciding, all at once, not to move. The hollow was not snarling. That was the thing Voss reported later in the incident review and the thing no one wanted to hear. It made no sound at all. It did not bear anything, did not raise anything, did not so much as tense. It simply came to the boy's side and stood there, calm as a dog on a porch, and looked at the 8 of them looking at it. And its stillness was the most articulate threat any being in that corridor had ever received. It said, without a syllable, that it knew exactly how many of them there were, and where each of them stood, and what each of them would have time to do, and that the answer was nothing. "Easy," Cal said. He did not look down at it. He kept his eyes on the prefect, and he lowered one hand slowly and laid it flat on the broad gray skull, and the great head leaned a fraction into his palm. "Easy. They're going." "We are not," Sarn began. "Prefect?" It was Voss, the Drael team lead, and Voss's weapon was already down, already pointed at the deck, and Voss's voice was very quiet. "We are back up. Everyone back up, now." They backed up. It was not a rout. Later, the incident office would take great care to record that it was an orderly withdrawal, executed on the team lead's judgment, in accordance with the standing no-pursuit doctrine. But every being in that corridor knew what it had been. 8 armored troopers and a containment prefect had come to cut a door and cull a monster, and they had left because a young man in his socks had asked them nicely to, with his hand on the monster's head, and the monster had let him. Prefect Olaf Sarn was the last to go. He stood at the 10-meter line for a long moment, his mantle plates ticking, his eye cluster moving from the boy to the beast and back, doing sums that would not come out. "You cannot keep it," he said at last. "I don't think I'm keeping it, Prefect," Cal said. "I think it's the other way around." The hatch of 14 Green 19 slid shut. Behind it, the heat signature that the Southern Concord had hunted for 2 years lay back down on a junior technician's floor, put its head across its paws, pointed its eyes at the door and slept, and the young man lay down on his bunk above it, and after a while slept too, and their breathing on the monitoring board 300 meters up station slowed and matched and became, to the horror of everyone watching, one rhythm. The Concord convened a session about it, because the Concord convened a session about everything, and because a problem it had filed under environmental hazard, no resolution had overnight become a problem it had to file under something with no folder at all. They held it in the lower antechamber off the concourse, a wide, bright room with a table shaped like a broken ring, and a ceiling of daylight panels tuned to the gold of Vantith. And they brought in the boy, and they made a mistake almost immediately, which was that they made him leave the animal outside. He agreed to it more easily than they expected. "He'll wait," Cal said, and the beast lay down in the concourse outside the antechamber doors in the open, under the great dorsal viewport, in full view of a market that emptied around it in a spreading ring of stalls suddenly closed and shoppers suddenly elsewhere, and it put its head on its paws and it waited, exactly as told, and that, a thing they could not contain, contained by nothing but a boy's word, unsettled the session more than any amount of snarling could have. Technician Marrow. The session chair was a V-Helk elder named Del Osso, older and grayer in the chitin than Ossiel, and inclined to fairness in the way of someone too old to enjoy a fight. "You understand why we are alarmed." "I understand you're alarmed," Cal said. "I'm not sure you understand why, though, if you don't mind me saying." Around the broken ring of the table, a dozen delegates of 9 species stiffened at that in 9 different ways. "Enlighten us," said Prefect Olaf Sarn, who had a seat at this table and a grievance the size of the station, "since you are the expert. 2 years my office has fought this thing, and you, a first cycle atmospherics tech with no training in xenofauna, no weapon and no apparent instinct for self-preservation, have it sleeping on your floor. So yes, enlighten us. What is it that we do not understand?" Cal looked around the broken ring. 9 species. 9 kinds of fear wearing 9 kinds of face, all of them turned to him, all of them wanting the same thing, which was for the small calm human to tell them the trick, the leash, the control, the word that made the monster safe. "You keep calling it a thing," Cal said. "That's the part you don't understand. It's not a thing. It's a person. Not a person like you or me. But it makes choices, and it kept its choices to itself for 2 years, and 3 nights ago it made one about me and came and knocked on my door to tell me, because it was done deciding." He paused. "You spent 2 years trying to figure out how to kill something you never once tried to talk to. And it spent 2 years watching the one member of your station who talked to it." "It is a predator," said Sarn. "So am I," Cal said mildly. "So are you. That's not the interesting part." The interesting part, as it turned out, took a xenobiologist to explain, and the Concord had one, and her name was Scholar Telm. Telm was ith, which meant she was a low, soft-bodied being who moved on a skirt of small limbs and thought in a cold that Cal found restful after the V-Helk's fretful energy. She had spent 2 years studying Specimen 6 the only way anyone could, which was from a distance, through the wreckage it left, and she had asked, more than once and always in vain, for permission to stop trying to kill it long enough to learn what it was. She spoke now from a low pedestal at the table's edge, and the antechamber's daylight panels lit her damp hide a soft pearl. The prefect is correct that it is a predator, she said. He is incorrect that this is the salient fact. May I show the council what I have? She had a great deal, and she showed it, and the room went quiet in a new way. Specimen 6 had come aboard Coriol Anchorage 2 years and 40 days earlier, in a survey pod out of a death world, the Concord's charts labeled only as System Gans 4, a young world, hot and wet and murderous, where the survey team had died to the last soul, and the automated pod had launched itself home with whatever had crawled aboard. What had crawled aboard was a juvenile grief, and a grief, Teln explained, was the apex of a world that grew nothing but apexes. Gans 4 has no prey species in the sense you would recognize, she said. Everything on Gans 4 is a predator. Everything hunts. To survive to adulthood there, a creature must be able to read the intention of every other creature it meets in a fraction of a second, to know on sight whether the thing across the clearing is stronger or weaker, whether it will fight or flee, whether it is worth the risk. A grief that misreads that once does not misread it twice. They are not merely killers. They are the finest readers of intent that our science has ever catalogued. It is how they choose their fights. It is how they survive a world where every fight can be the last. And it read the boy, said Del Asso slowly. It read all of us, Teln said, for 2 years. It read the prefect's teams, and it read the Drael war beasts, and it read every drone and every dock crew that came into the dark, and it made the same assessment of all of them, which is the assessment a grief makes of everything, prey, rival, or threat. Prey it culled, rivals it drove off, threats it removed. Her small limbs stilled. And then, some months ago, it encountered Technician Marrow, and for the first time in 2 years it made a 4th assessment, one its species reserves for a vanishingly small number of encounters in a lifetime, and one I did not believe I would ever see it make aboard this station. Which is, said Sarn, impatient. Kin, said Teln. The word sat in the bright room. Not kin of the blood, she went on, kin of the kind. A grief will occasionally, rarely, encounter another creature and read in it not prey, not rival, not threat, but a fellow apex, something that occupies the same station in the order of things that it does, and moves through the world the way it does, and is therefore neither to be hunted nor feared nor fought, but joined. On Gans 4 it is how the solitary young find the one companion they will keep. They do not choose by scent or by size. They choose by intent. They watch, sometimes for a very long time, and they choose the one being whose intention, in every circumstance, reads to them as an equal's. She turned her soft, dark facing toward Cal. It watched this station for 2 years, and it read every intelligent being aboard, and the only intent it recognized as its own, calm under threat, lethal without display, slow of hand and certain of purpose, belonged to a human atmospherics technician who kept warming its den and leaving it alone. Cal, who had been listening to all this with the still attention he gave to everything, said quietly, "That's why the offering." "The what?" said Del Asso. "It left me a kill, on the walkway, laid out, presented the way an animal shares. I moved it where it could take it back, and I told it thank you." He shrugged, a small human movement in a room full of aliens who did not have shoulders. "I didn't know I was answering a question. I thought I was just being polite." "You were answering a question," Teln said. "You answered it correctly. You accepted the share without fear and without greed, which is precisely how one apex tells another that the joining is agreeable. 3 nights later it came to your door." She paused. "In the literature of my own people, technician, there is an old word for what a grief does when it chooses. It does not tame. It does not submit. It joins. It is why in 2 years no weapon we brought to bear ever moved it, and no cage ever held it. You cannot cage a thing that has judged you beneath it. But a thing it has judged its equal, it will follow to the end of the dark. It has not decided to obey you." Her limbs rippled, the ith gesture for something like awe. "It has decided you are the one being on this station worth staying alive for. That is a great deal more dangerous, and a great deal harder to take away from you, than obedience would ever be." The antechamber was very quiet. "Then we are agreed," said Prefect Olaf Sarn into the quiet, "that it must be removed from the station immediately." Half the table began speaking at once. Cal did not. He waited until the noise crested and broke, and then he said, in the low, even voice that cut through a loud room precisely because it did not try to, "You can't remove it, Prefect. You couldn't remove it when it wanted nothing from you. You definitely can't remove it now that it wants something, and the something is me." "Then we remove you," Sarn said. "You take the transfer. You take it and you go, and you take your kin with you off my station, and Coriol's problem becomes some other port's problem, and the 80,000 souls in this ring can sleep." "You could try that," Cal said. "I'll tell you how it goes. You put me on a hull and it comes with me because it will always come with me, and now instead of one apex predator that keeps to the dark and asks for nothing, you've got a loose one in a departing ship's ventilation with no warm den, no routine, no me to keep it steady, and a crew that didn't sign up for it. You'll lose the ship." He let that sit. "Or you leave it here with me, on my run, in the dark where it spent 2 years harming nobody who left it alone, and you let the one arrangement that's ever worked keep working. Your choice, Prefect, but don't pretend the dangerous option is the one where I stay." They did not resolve it that session. Councils never resolve anything the first session. That is the nature of councils. But Del Osso, who was old and tired and fair, put a hold on any action against the animal or the human pending, further study under Scholar Teln's supervision, and adjourned, and the delegates filed out into the concourse where the beast still lay under the gold light of the viewport exactly where the boy had left it, and the boy walked out to it through a market that held its breath, and knelt, and the great gray head lifted, and he said something none of them could hear. And it rose and fell in beside him, and the two of them walked off across the concourse in the long gold light, with a kilometer of gas giant turning overhead, and the market did not breathe again until they were gone. Steward Ossiel found Cal that evening, back at the viewport at the quiet hour, with the beast lying at his feet like a gray rug that could end 9 species, and a cup of something warm in his hands. "You did not tell them its name," Ossiel said, lowering himself carefully onto the bench, a respectful distance from the animal, which watched him with mild dark eyes and did not otherwise move. "It doesn't have one, not from me." Cal looked down at the broad gray head. "The station calls it the Hollow. Your incident office calls it Specimen 6. Neither of those is a name. Those are what you call a thing you're afraid of, so you don't have to think about it as a someone. And you think of it as a someone. I think a someone spent 2 years working up the courage to knock on my door," Cal said. "Seems like the least I can do is call him something that isn't a case file number." Ossiel's mantle plates ticked softly. "What will you call him?" Cal was quiet a while. The storm on Vantith's face turned over, gold and slow, and the beast breathed at his feet, and up and down the empty concourse the station made its small night sounds. "On my world," he said, "there's a kind of weather, comes in off the plains in the cold season. Big gray front, moves quiet, fills up the whole sky before you notice it's there, and once it's over you it just sits. Doesn't storm much, just settles in and stays days at a time, gray and low and patient till it decides to move on." He set his cup down. "My grandmother used to call it a sitting sky, said you couldn't hurry it and you couldn't scare it off, so you might as well put another log on and let it keep you company." He laid a hand on the gray skull and the skull leaned into it. "Sit," he said to the beast, testing it. "That's you, sitting sky. I'll call you Sit for short." The beast, which had been sitting, went on sitting. "Yeah," Cal said. "That'll do." Ossiel watched the two of them under the gold light for a long time, the small still human and the enormous still animal, and he thought, being an administrator, he could not help but think it, that in 2 years of reports crossing his desk about the hollow of Coriol anchorage, not one had ever suggested that the reason it could not be caught was that it had never once, in all that time, actually been running. The trouble when it came did not come from the animal. It came, as trouble on a station usually does, from a being who was certain he was cleverer than the situation, and his name was Procurator Having, and he was not conquered at all but a broker off a chartered hull, in the business of acquiring rare and difficult things for buyers who paid for rare and difficult. And he had heard, the way brokers hear, that Coryall anchorage had something on it that had killed Drail war beasts and could not be caged. He watched the boy and the animal for 3 days. He was good at watching. It was his trade. He noted the technician's shift pattern, the empty runs on the cold spur below deck 12, the hours when the human went alone into the dark with the priceless thing padding at his heel and no one else within half a kilometer. He noted that the animal, whatever it was calm, controlled, docile as a hound to the human, and a docile apex to a mind like Having's was not a warning. It was an inventory item with the risk already removed. He made his move on the cold spur at the far end of Cal's run, where the light was old and the corridors were narrow and there were no monitors that worked, because Having had paid a maintenance clerk to be sure of that. He came with 2 hired hands and a capture rig, a collar of shaped charges and a sedative harpoon rated, the specifications promised, for anything with a spine. The plan was simple and on paper sound. Take the human first. A knife at the boy's throat and the docile animal would freeze, because that was what docile animals did when their master was threatened. And while it froze, the harpoon, and then a very rich man's ship, quietly departed with a sedated legend in the hold. Having got the first part right, he came out of a side chase behind the technician in the narrow dark and put an arm across the boy's chest and a blade under his jaw before the boy had finished turning, and he said, into the human's ear, in the reasonable tone he used for all his acquisitions, "Don't move, and tell your animal to hold, and everyone walks away from this." Cal held very still. The blade was cold against his jaw. 4 meters ahead, in the dark of the corridor, the gray shape that had been padding along at his heel had stopped and turned, and was looking back at the 2 of them with its matte black eyes, and it was not frozen. "You've made a mistake," Cal said quietly. "I've made a fortune," said Having. "Tell it to hold." "That's the mistake," Cal said. "He doesn't hold because you threaten me. He was never going to hold." He kept his voice low and even, the voice for frightened valves and skittish machines, except this time he was using it on the man with the knife, because the man with the knife was the one who needed steadying, and the man with the knife was too pleased with himself to hear it. "He holds because I'm calm. And right now the only thing keeping you alive is that I haven't stopped being calm. So I'd think very carefully about the next thing you do, because whatever it is, you've got about the length of this sentence to do it in." What happened next did not happen on any monitor, because Having had paid to be sure of that, and the 2 hired hands who came out of the cold spur afterward did not agree, when the incident office questioned them, on what they had seen. One said the gray shape had simply not been where it was. The other said the dark had reached out. Neither of them said it snarled or leapt or made a sound, because it did not. The record is very clear that the corridor stayed silent from beginning to end. What the record shows is a 9-second gap. 9 seconds, from the moment the blade touched the technician's jaw to the moment the technician keyed his emergency locator with a hand that was, the medics later confirmed, entirely steady. They found the capture rig. They found the 2 hired hands, unharmed and disinclined to remain on Coryall anchorage, waiting to be arrested with the eager cooperation of men who have decided that a cell is the safest place they can currently be. They did not find Procurator Having. The incident office searched the cold spur for a week. In the notes field of the final report, the investigating officer wrote, because it was the only honest thing to write, the same 3 words the station had been writing for 2 years. Location unknown. Recommend no pursuit. Cal finished his shift. Team lead Voss came down to the cold spur 2 days after the broker vanished, alone, off the roster, which was against every doctrine his own office had written. He told himself he came to inspect the site. That was a lie, and Voss was too old a soldier to lie to himself for long. He came because he had been in the warrens the day the war beasts died. He had held the leashes. He had given the order. He had watched 3 of the Concord's finest maulers go into the dark after Specimen 6 with their blood up and their hackles high, and he had watched the dark give him back nothing at all. And he had spent 2 years since then certain of one thing above all others: that the thing in the walls was a killing engine with no bottom to it, and that anyone who thought otherwise was a fool who had not yet been introduced. And now there was a fool sleeping soundly 2 decks up with the killing engine on his floor, and Voss could not make the 2 facts sit in the same head without one of them cracking, so he came down to the dark to look at the thing and settle which fact it was. He found the technician at the junction 9 elbow, on his back under a manifold, humming, and he found the beast lying in the corridor a body length off, head on paws, watching the human work with the half-lidded ease of an animal entirely at rest. And when Voss came around the elbow in his shell armor with 2 years of grief and certainty riding him, the beast's head came up, and its dark eyes found him, and it read him. Voss felt it happen. That was what he could never make the incident review understand. The thing looked at him, and something behind its eyes moved, some cold, instantaneous arithmetic. And Voss stood in the corridor with his hand near a weapon he had not decided to draw and felt himself weighed on a scale older than his species, prey, rival, threat, and felt the scale come to rest, and knew in his gut, in the old animal part of him the Drail were bred never to lose, that it had judged him no threat worth the trouble and dismissed him. Not spared, dismissed. There was a difference, and it was the most humbling difference Voss had ever been handed. Team lead. The human had slid out from under the manifold and was sitting up, wiping his hands, entirely unsurprised to find a Drail in his tunnel. You lost people down here, the beasts. I heard. I gave the order, Voss said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. 3 of them, best on the station. I sent them into the dark, and the dark kept them. Cal looked at the beast, and the beast looked back at him, and something passed between them that Voss could not read. And then Cal said quietly, "They came in loud, didn't they? Blood up, teeth out, hunting. They were war beasts, that is what they." "I know, I'm not blaming them or you." Cal got to his feet unhurried. "I'm just telling you what he'd have seen. 3 big things coming at him fast in his own dark, all posture and noise, telling him plain as anything that they meant to end him. So he ended them first. That's not cruelty, team lead. That's the same math you do. That's the same math they were doing. He was just faster and quieter and better at it because he grew up somewhere worse than they did." He paused. "He's never touched anything down here that didn't come at him first. 2 years, check your own records. Everything the Hollow ever took a run at it or took a run at me. It doesn't hunt for sport. Nothing does where he's from. Sport's a thing you can afford, he can't." Voss stood in the old dark and did the thing he had come down to do, which was to look at the animal and settle which of his 2 cracked facts was true, and found that the answer was neither, that there had been a 3rd fact all along that he had been too full of grief to see. The war beasts had died hunting. And the thing that killed them was, at this moment, lying on a maintenance corridor floor with its chin on its paws, watching a human boy work, calm as any hound Voss had ever raised on any hearth. It had not been a killing engine with no bottom. It had been a soldier defending its ground, and then, when the ground stopped being attacked, it had simply stopped. War beasts could not do that. Voss had trained war beasts his whole life, and not one of them, once its blood was up, had ever been able simply to stop. That was the difference between a war beast and an apex, and Voss had spent 2 years hating the wrong animal for being better at his own trade than anything he'd ever bred. "What is its name?" Voss said, and was surprised to find he wanted to know. "Sit," Cal said. Voss looked at the enormous gray thing sitting. "That is not much of a name for it." "No," Cal agreed, "but it's not much of a thing for sitting either, and it does that all day so." Voss left the cold spur a changed being. though it would take him a while to know it, and on his way up he did a thing that later he could not fully account for. He stopped at the Deck 12 kennel where the station's remaining war beasts were housed, and he stood at the run of the oldest and best of them, a scarred old mauler named Core S who had been leashed the day the others died, held back only because Voss had run out of hands, and he watched old Core S, who feared nothing, who had faced ship fires and boarding actions and the worst the docks could produce, catch a scent off Voss's armor, the cold mineral musk of the cold spur, and lie down flat, and put its scarred muzzle between its paws, and go absolutely still, deferring to a smell, to the ghost of a thing 2 decks away that it had never seen and would never fight. Voss stood at the run for a long time. Then he went and found Steward Ossiel and he said, "The animal on the technician's floor. It is not a hazard to be contained. Take it off my roster and off the prefect's. Put it on the roster of things the station simply has, like the viewport or the dark. That is my recommendation as the officer who lost the most to it." And he would not say more, and he went off shift, and he did not come back to the cold spur because he did not need to. He had settled his fact. Life on Coriol Anchorage arranged itself around the arrangement, the way life does. Cal worked his run, and Sit worked it with him, and the cold spur below Deck 12 became, over the following weeks, the best-maintained sector of the station, because there was suddenly no shortage of nobody wanting to be there and exactly one technician entirely willing. The freighter rats, which had plagued the residential returns for a decade, thinned to nothing on Cal's decks and then on the decks above, as Sit ranged the warrens on the slow patrols of a creature with a territory and a household to keep, and the atmospherics ran cleaner than they had in living memory, and the residents of Deck 14, who had spent 2 years with a monster under their feet, slowly noticed that their air had never been better and their pest complaints had never been fewer, and did not connect the two facts, and were happier for the ignorance. The Orin engineers who had refused to touch the Deck 14 manifold began, cautiously, to accompany Cal on his easier runs, because a warren with the hollow in it and on your side was, they worked out, the safest warren on the station, and because there is no anxiety a working being will not eventually set down if the alternative is doing his job. They learned to move slowly around Sit, and to speak low and not to run, and Cal taught them the first rule his father had taught him, and it took, because it was a good rule, and the incident rate in the lower warrens fell to 0 and stayed there. Scholar Telm came to the cold spur nearly every shift, and sat at a respectful distance on her skirt of small limbs, and studied the 2 of them, and slowly stopped studying the animal and started studying the boy, because the animal, she concluded, was doing exactly what its nature dictated, and the interesting variable was the human who had, without training or intent, met an apex predator's standard for kinship and gone on quietly warming its den. "Do you understand what you are?" she asked him once, to it. "His person," Cal said. "More than that. To a grief, the joined one is not a possession and not a master. It is the fixed point, the single certainty in a world it otherwise assesses moment to moment, threat by threat, forever. Everything else it must read and reread and never trust. It does not have to read. You are the one thing it has decided permanently is safe. That is not a small thing to be, technician. It is, in the whole architecture of that creature's mind, the only load-bearing wall." Her limbs rippled. "I would not want to be the being who tried to remove it." "Nobody's removing it," Cal said. "No," Teln agreed, watching Sit sleep in the warm exchanger room while the boy recoiled a hose. "But there is a being on this station who has not yet accepted that, and he runs containment, and he has just had a visiting broker vanish on his watch, and he is a bureaucrat with a grievance and a body he cannot produce. I would keep an eye on the prefect, technician. Grievance is a kind of hunting too. It is only slower." Prefect Olaf Sarn was, in fact, hunting in the slow, bureaucratic way Teln had named, and he had found what every frustrated official eventually finds, which is a procedure. He could not move against the animal directly. Del Osso's hold saw to that, and the hold had teeth. But the broker had been a chartered visitor to Coriol Anchorage, registered, bonded, and this was the crucial thing, the thing Sarn built his whole slow campaign upon, a citizen of a conquered member world, whose disappearance on the station created an obligation the station could not simply file under no pursuit. There would be an inquiry. There would have to be an inquiry. And an inquiry meant an inspector, and an inspector meant a fresh set of eyes from off the station, eyes that had never watched a boy walk a monster across the concourse under the gold light and understood, the way the station had slowly come to understand, that the arrangement worked. A visitor is dead, Sarn told the inquiry request he filed with the Southern Concord's Corps, and he was careful to write it exactly that way, dead and not vanished, because dead created an obligation and vanished created only a shrug. Killed by an uncontained apex predator that a station employee has been permitted to house on a residential deck in defiance of standing containment doctrine. The station's leadership has placed a hold on all corrective action. I request an independent compliance inspector be dispatched to review the station's failure to contain a known lethal hazard and to compel appropriate action. He did not mention that the dead visitor had come to the station to steal the animal at knife point. He did not mention the capture rig, or the 2 hired hands, or the blade found on the cold spur floor with a technician's blood dried on its edge. Those facts were in the incident file, where an inspector would eventually find them, but Sarn had been a bureaucrat a long time, and he knew that the first framing of a thing is the framing that sticks, and he made sure the request landed on the Corps' desk framed as a dead citizen and a failure to contain, and he let the machinery of the Concord do the rest. The machinery of the Concord dispatched a compliance inspector. Her name was Assessor Vane Corrid, and she was V. Helk, and she arrived on Coriol Anchorage 11 days later on a fast cutter with a compliance writ, a small hard staff, and the settled certainty of an official who has read a file and formed a view and come a long way to enforce it. She was not cruel. Cruelty was not the danger with Vane Corrid. The danger with Vane Corrid was that she was correct, procedurally, about a great many things, and procedurally correct beings who have never once stood under the gold light and watched the boy and the beast walk home together are the most dangerous beings a good arrangement can encounter, because they do not hate it. They simply do not see it, and they have a writ, and the writ does not have eyes. "Show me the animal," was the first thing Assessor Corrid said, stepping off the cutter onto Coriol Anchorage, and Prefect Olaf Sarn, who had waited 2 years for someone to say exactly that with the authority to make it matter, inclined his mantle and said, "This way, Assessor," and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the slow hunt was finally going his way. Assessor Vane Corrid met the animal in the lower antechamber, under the daylight panels, with her staff arrayed behind her and her writ in a sealed case at her side, and she was not impressed, which was the first thing about her that frightened Cal. He had seen a great many reactions to sit by now, fear mostly, awe from Teln. The slow, grudging respect that had turned Voss around, panic in the markets, deference in the kennels. But Assessor Corrid looked at the largest predator the Concord had catalogued in a generation, lying calm at a young human's feet, and her mantle plates did not so much as tick, and she consulted a slate and she said, "This is the hazard." "This is SIT," Cal said. "This is Specimen 6, listed on the station manifest as an uncontained apex predator of System Gans 4, responsible over 26 months for the loss of 19 maintenance units, 3 military assets, and no fewer than 4 sapient lives, the most recent being a bonded Concord citizen." She read it off the slate in a flat, clean voice, the voice of a being to whom a list was a kind of truth. "You are the station employee housing it." "I am." "On what authority?" Cal considered the question, which was a fair one procedurally and had no procedural answer. "None you'd recognize," he said. "It knocked," I answered. Assessor Corrid looked up from her slate for the first time. She had a V-Helix eye cluster, and she turned the whole of it on him, and Cal understood that he had just been filed. "Technician Marrow," she said, "I'm going to be plain with you because I find plainness saves everyone time. I have read the station's file. I am aware of the circumstances of the broker Having's disappearance. I am aware that he came here to steal this animal and that he threatened your life to do it. I want you to understand that none of that changes my assessment, and I want you to understand why, because you seem to be a serious person and I would rather you cooperate than be managed." She set the slate down. A hazard is not defined by the character of the beings it harms. Having was a criminal. His death, if he is dead, is no loss to anyone including his buyers. That is irrelevant. What is relevant is that a thing exists on this station which can end a sapient life in 9 seconds, off every monitor without a sound, and which answers to no protocol, no cage, and no authority but the informal goodwill of a first-cycle technician with no training and no rank. That is not a companion technician. That is a loaded weapon that has decided it likes you. And weapons that have decided things are the most dangerous weapons there are, because the day it decides differently, about you, about a neighbor, about a child in a corridor who runs when it would have been wiser to stand still, there is nothing on this station that can intervene. I'm not here to punish an animal for being what it is. I am here because 80,000 souls are sleeping above a thing no one can stop, and someone off the station finally has to say so out loud. It was, Cal thought, the most honest case anyone had made yet, and the most wrong, and the hardest to answer because so much of it was true. "You're right that nothing can stop him," Cal said slowly. "You're wrong that nothing's steering him. I am, not with a cage, not with a protocol. With being the thing he's calm around. You keep saying nobody can intervene if he decides differently. Assessor, he's not going to decide differently, any more than that viewport's going to decide to stop holding air. But even if I'm wrong, even if the worst thing you can imagine happens, think about what you're actually proposing. You want to take away the one arrangement that's kept him steady for months, because it might fail someday, and replace it with the arrangement that already failed for 2 years. You want to make him unsteady on purpose, to feel safer." He shook his head. "I've kept animals my whole life, Assessor. You don't make a thing safe by frightening it. You make it dangerous." "I am not proposing to frighten it," Corrid said. "I am proposing to remove it." "There is a difference." "There's really not," Cal said. "Not to him." Assessor Corrid picked up her slate. "The station will convene a formal compliance session in 3 days," she said. "I will present my findings. I will recommend that Specimen 6 be transferred off-station under sedation to a secure xenofauna holding facility, where it can be studied and contained without risk to a civilian population. You may present your objection. I will hear it fairly. But I will tell you now, technician, so that you are not surprised. I have never yet found a reason to leave a lethal, uncontained hazard in a residential ring, and I do not expect to find one here, and my writ does not require the station's consent." She turned to go. Then she stopped and looked back, not unkindly. "You care for it, I can see that. I'm not blind to it. But you are 22 years old and you have decided that your feeling for an animal outweighs the safety of 80,000 strangers, and someday, when you are older, you will understand why beings like me exist to make that decision for beings like you." She inclined her mantle. "In 3 days." She left. Her staff filed out after her, and Sit, who had lain calm and still through the whole of it, watching the assessor with mild dark eyes, rose to his feet as the antechamber doors closed, and turned his great head to Cal and made, for the first time since the knock, a sound. It was very low, felt more than heard, a note that came up through the deck plate and into the soles of Cal's feet, and it was not a growl. Cal had heard the beast do many silent things, and this was the first sound it had ever offered him, and it was, he realized, a question. The animal had read the room, the way it read every room, and it had understood, in whatever way it understood such things, that the tall, unafraid V-Helk had come to take the boy's calm away, and it was asking the fixed point of its whole existence what they were going to do about it. "I don't know yet," Cal said honestly and put his hand on the gray skull. "But we're not running. We've established that. Running's a language and we don't speak it, so we'll do the other thing." The great head leaned into his palm. "We'll sit," Cal said, "and we'll see who blinks." Word of the compliance session went around Coryell Anchorage the way word goes around any small place, which is instantly and wrong in the details. And by the second day, the station had taken a side, and the side surprised everyone including the station. It began in the markets under the viewport, where the traders who had spent 2 years emptying their stalls whenever the boy walked past with the beast had, without quite noticing the shift, stopped. Somewhere in the weeks of the arrangement, they had grown used to the gray-shaped padding com at the technician's heel, and used to the fact that their air ran clean and their storerooms ran free of vermin, and used, most of all, to the peculiar civic pride of being the station with the hollow, the port that housed the thing that could not be caught, that answered to a boy, that no other station in the Concord could claim. A monster in the walls is a terror. A monster that keeps your air clean and sleeps at the feet of one of your own is a legend, and beings will defend a legend, they will not defend a terror. Osseo felt the shift first, being an administrator whose whole trade was feeling shifts, and he brought it to Del Osso, who was old and fair and had put the original hold in place, and the two of them looked at the manifest of complaints the assessor's arrival had generated and found that nearly all of them were complaints about the assessor. "The Dock Guild has filed an objection," Osseo said. "The Atmospherics Union, the Residential Council of Deck 14, the very deck elder has filed a petition, signatures from 90 households requesting that the animal be permitted to remain. They call it, and I am reading directly, the good neighbor below." He set the slate down. 2 years we could not give this thing away. Now the station will not let us take it. "Because it stopped being a monster and started being theirs," Del Osso said. "It is a very old story, Osseo. It is only the shape of the animal that is new." He steepled his forelimbs. "The difficulty is that the assessor is not wrong. That is what makes her dangerous. If she were a fool we could outweight her. But she is correct on the record on the doctrine about a genuine risk, and she has a writ, and the station's affection for its monster is not a legal argument. 90 households do not outweigh a compliance finding. They only make one harder to enforce." "Then we make it very hard to enforce," Osseo said. Del Osso looked at his steward for a long moment, and something old and stubborn moved behind his ancient eye cluster. "Careful, Osseo," he said. "You are proposing that we obstruct a Concord compliance officer in the discharge of a lawful writ. That is a serious thing. It ends careers. It has ended stations." "I am proposing," Osseo said, "that we let her try to sedate and cage a thing that has judged us all beneath it, and see what her writ is worth when she does. I am proposing that we do nothing at all, elder, very correctly and very slowly, and let the animal make her case for her." He paused. "You said it yourself. The station's affection is not a legal argument, but the station's affection is not the argument I am relying on. I am relying on the fact that in 2 years, everything that came for that creature with force in its hand did not come back. And I am relying on the assessor being just procedurally certain enough to send men to do the one thing the boy keeps warning everyone not to do." Del Osso was quiet for a long time under the gold light of the daylight panels. "That is a terrible plan," he said at last. "It relies on beings being hurt to make its point." "No," Osseo said. "It relies on the assessor choosing whether beings are hurt. The boy will warn her. He warns everyone. He has never once failed to warn. If she listens, no one is hurt and the animal stays, because a thing that harms no one who leaves it alone cannot be justly caged. And if she does not listen," he spread his forelimbs, a V-Helk shrug, "then the harm is hers, elder, and the record will show she was warned and warned and warned by a 22-year-old technician she called a child." Cal did not know about any of that. Cal spent the 2 days before the session doing what he always did, which was his job, and one other thing, which was preparing. He was not preparing to fight. He had told Sit the truth. They were not running, and they were not fighting either, because fighting was just running with your teeth showing, and it ended the same way. He was preparing to be immovable, which is a different discipline, and it was the only discipline he had ever been any good at. On the last night before the session, he sat in his quarters with Sit's great head across his knees, a weight like a fallen beam, warm through the fabric of his coveralls, and he talked to the animal the way he'd talked to it through the door that first night, low and even, not because it understood the words, but because it understood the water they came in. "I know what she's going to do," he said. "She's going to be reasonable. That's the hard part. She's not a having. She's not going to threaten me and give you a clean reason to end it. She's going to come with a writ and a sedative and 8 people who are just following orders, and she's going to be right about every single thing on her list and wrong about the only thing that matters, and she's going to make me the unreasonable one for standing here." He scratched the flat gray hide behind where an ear would be if the beast had ears. "And you're going to want to help. I know you are. You've decided I'm the load-bearing wall, Teln says, and something's coming at the wall, and everything in you is going to want to do about it what you did about having." His hand went still. "You can't. Do you hear me? Whatever happens in that room, you can't. Because the second you do, she's right. The whole station's watched us for weeks and made up its mind we're safe, and it's true, we are, but it's only true as long as you never once prove her list correct. The list says you're a weapon that decided things. The only answer to the list is to keep deciding over and over in front of everyone to do nothing at all." He looked into the matte dark eyes. "That's the hardest thing I'll ever ask you. I'm sorry. But you knocked on my door and I answered, and this is what answering costs. We sit. We sit and we let them be wrong about us out loud, and we don't give them one single thing that makes them right." The beast breathed, slow and enormous on his knees. Whether it understood a word of it, Cal never knew. But the next morning, when the session convened, and it mattered more than anything had ever mattered, it sat, and it went on sitting, no matter what they did, and that a thing that could have ended the room choosing, in front of everyone, again and again, to do nothing at all, turned out to be the most human thing anyone on Coriol Anchorage had ever seen a monster do. The compliance session filled the lower antechamber past its walls. By doctrine it should have been a closed hearing. The assessor, the elder, the prefect, the technician of record, and a clerk to keep the log. But the residential council of Deck 14 had a petition and the right to present it, and the Dock Guild had a standing and the right to observe, and the Atmospherics Union had filed to speak. And by the time the daylight panels came up gold over the broken ring of the table, there were beings of 9 species standing 3 deep along every wall of the antechamber, and more in the concourse outside, and the market under the viewport had, for the first time in the memory of anyone present, closed itself voluntarily so that its traders could come and stand and watch. Cal came in with Sid at his heel, and the crowd made a lane for them without being asked, and he walked the length of it to the empty place at the table and sat. And the beast lay down beside his chair in full view of 200 witnesses and put its head on its paws, and the room, which had been a low roar, went quiet. Assessor Vane Corrid was not moved by the crowd. That was the thing Cal kept having to remind himself. She looked at the packed antechamber the way she looked at everything, as a set of facts to be weighed, and she opened her case, and she laid her writ on the table, and she began. She was thorough. Cal had known she would be. She read the manifest of losses across 26 months, unit by unit, asset by asset, life by life, and she read them in a flat, clean voice that did not editorialize because it did not need to. The list did the work. 19 maintenance units, 3 war beasts, 4 sapient lives, the last a bonded citizen. She entered the incident files. She entered the containment doctrine, the standing order below Deck 12, the 2 years of failed pursuit. She built, brick by procedural brick, an edifice that no being in the room could honestly call false, and when she was done she stood in front of it and said, "I will hear the objection now," and sat, and folded her forelimbs and waited. Cal stood. He was aware of how he looked. He had thought about it the night before with the beast's head on his knees, a 22-year-old atmospherics technician in clean but worn coveralls, small among the tall species, plain-faced, unrehearsed, with no writ and no rank and no argument the assessor's edifice would recognize as an argument. He could not outbrick her. He had known that for 2 days, so he did not try. "Everything the assessor read is true," he said. A stir went through the packed room. He let it settle. "Every unit on that list, every asset, every life, it's all true, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you it isn't, because you'd stop trusting me and you'd be right too." He put one hand lightly on the gray skull beside his chair. "But I want to add 3 words to her list, and then I want you to read it again. Here are the 3 words. They came first." He looked around the broken ring. Every single thing on that list came at him, or came at someone he decided to keep before he ever touched it. The units cornered him in the dark with cutting lamps. The war beasts came in hunting, blood up, teeth out. Team lead Voss will tell you so himself. He gave the order. "The lives a broker with a knife at my throat and 3 dock crew who went below 12 on a dare to poke the monster and found out the monster pokes back. 19 units, 3 assets, 4 lives. Read the list again with the 3 words in front of it. They came first. Every time for 2 years. He paused. "That's not a hazard, assessor. A hazard doesn't check who started it. That's a thing that has never once in 2 years harmed anybody who left it alone. And there are 80,000 souls in this ring, and it's had 2 years in the run of the walls, and it's harmed 26 of them, and every one of the 26 had a weapon or a cutting lamp or a knife in his hand when he met it. He let that number stand in the bright room. You want to talk about odds for 80,000 strangers? Those are the odds. Leave it alone, it leaves you alone. There isn't a weapon in your armory with a safety record that good." Assessor Corrid's mantle plates ticked once. A defensive killer is still a killer, technician. The child in the corridor who runs will not have a weapon in his hand, and the animal will not stop to check his intentions before. "Test it," Cal said. The room went very still. "You've built your whole case on what he might do to somebody harmless who moves wrong," Cal said. "You've said it twice now, the child who runs, the neighbor, the innocent who panics. So test it. Right here, in front of everybody. You've got 8 troopers on that wall who'd love the excuse. Send one at him, not with a weapon. I'd never ask you to put anyone at real risk, and I mean that. Send one at him fast, shouting, arms up. Everything a panicking innocent does, everything your case says sets him off. Do it now in this room, with 200 witnesses, and let's all find out together whether your hazard is a hazard or whether it's a thing that spent 2 years being blamed for finishing fights it never started." It was, Del Osso thought from the head of the table, either the bravest thing or the most reckless thing he had ever watched a young being do, and he could not tell which, and he suspected the boy could not either. Assessor Corrid looked at the technician for a long moment. Then she looked at the animal, lying calm beside the boy's chair, watching the room with mild dark eyes. And then, because she was, whatever else, an honest official, and an honest official cannot refuse a fair test in front of 200 witnesses without conceding she is afraid of the answer, she said, "One of my staff, not a trooper. Troopers move like threats even unarmed. A clerk, unarmed, no protective gear, at my order." She turned to her small hard staff along the wall. Assessor's aide Pell stepped forward. The aide who stepped forward was young for a V-Helk, and plainly terrified, and to his lasting credit he came anyway. "Aide Pell," Corrid said, "you will cross the room toward the animal at speed. You will shout. You will raise your forelimbs. You will do everything a frightened being does in a corridor. You will stop at 3 meters and no closer, and if at any point the animal so much as rises, you will drop flat and the troopers will do what they can, which will not be enough, and I will have proven my case with your life, and I am sorry to ask it of you." Her eye cluster turned to Cal. "You will keep your hands at your sides, technician. If you steady it, the test proves nothing. It must be the animal's choice, unaided, or it is no test at all." "Agreed," Cal said, and stepped back from the beast and put his hands behind him and stood clear. For the first time since the knock, Cal Marrow took his hand off the animal and left it to decide alone. "Aide Pell," said Assessor Corrid, "now." The aide ran. He came across the bright antechamber at a dead sprint, forelimbs high, a thin, panicked cry tearing out of him, doing everything a bolting innocent does, everything 2 years of incident files said would trip the killing arithmetic behind the beast's dark eyes, a small, fast shape rushing straight at it, screaming out of the light. 200 beings drew breath at once. Along the wall, 8 troopers' hands went to 8 weapons. Prefect Olith Sarn came half out of his seat with something like hope on his mantle, and Cal Marrow stood with his hands behind his back and his hands empty, and did the hardest thing he had ever done, which was nothing at all, and trusted a monster to be what he had told the whole station it was. The beast lifted its head. It watched the screaming shape rush toward it, and behind its matte black eyes the old instantaneous arithmetic ran, the arithmetic of a world where everything was a predator and a misread meant death, the arithmetic that had ended 19 units and 3 war beasts and 4 armed lives, and it read the running aid the way it read everything, in a fraction of a second, completely. And it laid its head back down. Aide Pell stumbled to a halt at 3 meters, chest heaving, cry dying in his throat, staring at an apex predator that had looked at him running and screaming and closing fast, and had judged him correctly as no threat at all, as exactly what he was, a frightened, harmless being making noise, and had declined to do a single thing about it. The beast breathed. It watched the aide with mild, dark eyes. Its chin stayed on its paws. It had made, in front of 200 witnesses, precisely the choice its whole reputation said it could not make, and it had made it the way it made everything, without display, without effort, without a sound. The antechamber erupted. Del Osso let it run for a moment because some noise cannot be gavelled and should not be, and then he brought it down, and into the settling quiet he said, "The record will show that the animal, tested under the assessor's own conditions and at the assessor's own order, presented with a fleeing unarmed being at speed, took no action whatsoever." He turned his ancient eye cluster to Corrid. "Assessor, in light of the demonstration, do you withdraw your finding?" And here Cal's heart, which had held steady through everything, finally dropped, because Assessor Vane Corrid rose to her full height, and her mantle plates were entirely still, and she said, "No." The room's joy curdled. "One trial is not a safety record," Corrid said, into the silence, and her clean, flat voice did not waver. "It is one trial. I do not doubt the technician's sincerity, and I do not doubt what we all just saw. But I have watched a great many hazards behave beautifully under observation, and lethally the moment observation ends, and my writ does not permit me to gamble 80,000 lives on a single afternoon's good conduct by a creature we do not understand, cannot contain, and cannot predict past the goodwill of one young man who will not always be here." She gathered her writ from the table. "My finding stands. Specimen 6 is to be sedated and transferred to secure holding for study. I will conduct the removal myself, under my own authority, with a specialist team, in a manner designed to minimize risk to the animal and to the station. It will take place tomorrow, at the shift change, when the concourse is clear." She sealed her case. "Technician Marrow, you have my respect, and you have my sympathy, and you have my warning. Do not obstruct the removal. If you interfere, you will be detained for the duration, and the animal will be handled without the benefit of your presence, which none of us wants. I would rather you were there. But I will do this with you or without you, because that is what the writ requires, and the writ, unlike the affection of this station, does not have the luxury of being wrong." She left. Her staff filed out after her, the young aide Pell last of all, still shaking, casting one bewildered backward look at the animal that had chosen, for no reason his species could name, to let him live. And Cal stood in the roaring room with his hand back on the gray skull, and felt the beast lean into his palm, and understood that they had won every argument in that antechamber, and lost the only one that came with a writ, and that tomorrow, at the shift change, they were going to have to find out together what it actually cost to sit still while the reasonable ones came to take your calm away. Watch Officer Thren drew the monitor shift for the removal, and she did not want it, and she took it anyway, because she had opened the whole story 2 years and a lifetime ago logging the loss of a drone at Junction 9, and it seemed to her that if the story was going to close she owed it the courtesy of watching it close. She had the concourse boards, the residential boards, and the full sensor net of the lower Warren spread across her console, and she had, for the first time in 2 years, a live gold track on the Deck 14 board, where the animal's heat signature lay curled beside the boys in the small box of Unit 14 Green 19, the two of them breathing in the one slow rhythm that had horrified the whole monitoring suite the first night and now, she found, only made her tired and sad. The plan crossed her board at the shift change bell. It was a good plan. Thren could see that, watching it deploy, and it made her sadder still, because a good plan meant thoughtful beings had sat in a room and worked hard to do a thing she had come to believe was wrong. Assessor Corrid did not send troopers to the boys' door. She had learned from the prefect's first night fiasco. Instead, she did it in 2 clean movements, the way you take anything that guards something. You separate the guard from the guarded, and then you deal with each alone. The first movement was the boy. At the shift bell, 2 of Corrid's staff came to 14 Green 19, unarmed, correct, and informed Technician Marrow that his presence was required at the administrative office to complete transfer documentation for the animal, and that he was requested to come alone, and that the animal was to remain in quarters, and that this was not a request he could decline, as the removal would proceed with or without his cooperation, and his signature was needed either way. It was true, all of it, in the narrow procedural way the assessor made things true. And Cal, who had spent all night deciding how to meet exactly this, looked at the 2 aides and looked at the beast, and understood the trap for what it was, and understood also that fighting it was the one move that made everything worse. Thren watched the boy's cold track leave the residential board, alone, headed up station to the office, and watched the gold track of the animal stay behind in the empty quarters and thought, there it is. They have their separation. Now comes the hard part, and the boy is 300 meters away for it, exactly as they intended. The second movement was the animal, and it began 90 seconds after the boy's track cleared Deck 14. Corrid's specialist team came down the residential spur in soft approach. No shell armor, no cutting gear, nothing that read as a threat to a creature that measured threat for a living. 4 handlers with a sedative rig built for mass, a delivery drone rigged to place the dart from beyond reach, and a plan to put the animal down clean and quiet in the one place it felt safest, its den, while its person signed papers 3 decks up and never had to watch. Thren had to admit it was almost merciful. If it worked, the boy would come back to an empty room and a signed transfer, and the animal already gone, sedated and unharmed. Off to a holding cell it would wake in confused and alive, and the station would keep its 80,000 and lose its legend, and no one would be hurt at all. It did not work. Thren saw the exact moment it began to go wrong, and she saw it on the thermal board before the team saw it in the corridor. Because that was the nature of her trade, she watched the numbers, and the numbers were always a half-second ahead of the flesh. The gold track in Unit 14 Green 19 moved. It should not have moved. The team had not reached the door. The drone had not deployed. Nothing in the corridor had yet threatened the animal in any way a being could name. But the animal was not a being that waited to be threatened in a way beings could name. It was the finest reader of intent the conquered science had ever catalogued, and it had spent months learning the rhythm of its person's days down to the breath, and its person had just been walked out of their shared den, alone, at an odd hour, by strangers, up station, away. And then strangers had begun to move down the residential spur toward the den in the particular soft, careful way that predators move when they are hunting something they respect. It did not need a weapon in the corridor to read the shape of the thing. It had read the shape of the thing the moment the boys walked out the door and did not come back. And it did what any apex does when the fixed point of its whole existence is removed and hunters converge on its empty den. It went to find its person. "It's out," Thren said into the command channel, and heard her own voice stay level, and was distantly proud of it, the way she had been proud 2 years ago, and understood that she had come full circle to the same flat calm, and it had bought the station nothing then and would buy it nothing now. Specimen 6 is out of quarters and moving up spur. It's not. She watched the gold track pour through the warrens, through the coolant chases, through the return runs it knew better than any map, 100 meters in the time it took her to find the words. It's not going for the team. It's going around them. It's going up. It's going after the boy. On her board, the specialist team stood in an empty corridor outside an empty den with a sedative rig and a merciful plan, and the thing they had come to put quietly to sleep was already 3 junctions past them and climbing, silent, through the walls, toward the administrative office where Assessor Vane Corrid had 3 decks up just separated a young human from the one certainty in a monster's whole life, and had not, in all her thoroughness, in all her procedural correctness, in all her careful mercy, stopped to ask what a grief does when you take its person away. Cal knew the instant it went wrong, because the station told him. He was in the administrative office, alone, exactly as arranged, with a transfer document on a slate in front of him, and one of Corrid's aides across the desk explaining, in a low apologetic voice, where he was to place his authorization, when the emergency tone sounded through the office, and the aide's own comm lit, and the aide's mantle went rigid as the report came through. And Cal watched the being's face do the thing faces do when a careful plan meets an animal that did not read the plan. And he was already standing. "Where is he?" Cal said. "Technician, please remain." "Where is he?" Cal did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. But there was something in it now that put the aide back a step, and it was not anger, it was certainty, the flat certainty of a man who has been proven right about the one thing he begged everyone not to make him prove. "You separated us. I told you not to. I told all of you in the room in front of everybody, the one thing that keeps him steady is me, and you took me away and sent a team to his den. He's not steady. He's looking for me. And every armed being between him and this office is standing in the way of the calmest arrangement this station has ever had, and none of them know it yet." He came around the desk. "Open the door or he'll open it. Those are the choices now, and only one of them's quiet." The aide, to his credit, opened the door. Cal went out into the upstation corridors at a fast walk. Not a run, never a run, into a station coming apart at the seams of its own good plan. The shift change crowds were still thick in the concourse, and the emergency tone had turned them, and beings of 9 species were moving in the confused countercurrents of a crowd that has been told there is danger and not told where. And into that Thren's calm voice was pouring station-wide instruction. Clear the residential spurs. Hold position. Do not run. And the crowd was doing what crowds do with the instruction do not run, which is to begin, at the edges, to run. And somewhere in the walls above and around all of it, silent, patient, faster than anything they had, the gray shape was coming up through the station's bones toward the one fixed point it had left, reading every intent it passed, and finding, everywhere it looked, exactly the thing its whole reputation was built on: armed beings, moving fast, converging, afraid. Cal did the only thing he knew how to do. He found the nearest station panel, and he keyed the general channel with a technician's override that he was absolutely not authorized to use, and he put his own voice out across Coriol Anchorage, low and even, into every corridor and every deck and every panicking crowd, the voice for frightened valves and skittish machines, and now, a whole terrified station and the monster loose in its walls. This is Cal Marrow. The station's own speakers carried it, steady, unhurried, everywhere at once. Everybody stop moving. The animal is not hunting. The animal is looking for me, and it will not touch a single one of you unless you put yourself between us with a weapon in your hand. So put the weapons down and stand still and let him come to me. Assessor Corrid, if you can hear this, call your people off. Right now. Not because I'm asking. Because you're about to find out you were right about exactly one thing, which is that nobody on this station can stop him, and the only being who can steer him is standing in the concourse under the viewport with his hands empty, waiting for his animal to come home. He paused, and the whole station held its breath with him. Stand still, all of you, and watch what he does when nobody makes him do anything. That's your test, Assessor. Here it comes. And Cal walked out into the open concourse, under the kilometer of gold light pouring down from the great dorsal viewport, into the wide, bright, cleared space where the markets had emptied, and he stopped in the middle of it with 200 beings frozen along its edges and 8 troopers frozen at its mouths, and Assessor Vane Corrid herself frozen at the office door above, and he put his hands at his sides, and he stood, small and still and entirely calm. And he waited for the deadliest thing on Coriol Anchorage to arrive. It came out of the high wall. There was a maintenance grill 40 meters up the curved flank of the concourse, one of 100 that fed the markets their air, and the grill did not open so much as cease to be an obstacle. The ash-gray shape was behind it, and then it was not, pouring down the sheer wall in a controlled fall that no watching being would afterward be able to describe. 40 meters of vertical metal taken in the time it takes to gasp. And then it was on the concourse deck under the gold light in full view of 200 souls, the hollow of Coriol Anchorage, out of the walls at last, in the open, in the day. Every weapon on the concourse came up. Hold, Cal said, over the station channel over the frozen crowd, and his voice did not change. Hold your fire. Nobody's touching anybody. Watch him. He's coming to me. And that was the thing. That was what Thren saw on her boards and what 200 beings saw with their own eyes. The deadliest creature the Conquered had catalogued did not check its speed toward the armed troopers, did not turn on the crowd that had panicked and bolted, did not do a single one of the things 2 years of files predicted. It flowed across the open concourse toward the one small, still figure standing empty-handed in the center of the gold light, straight and certain. A gray arrow loosed at the only fixed point in its world, and the arrow was going home. And then the child stepped into its path. Afterward, when the incident office reconstructed it, they would establish that the child was an Oran juvenile named Sesk, 7 years old by the reckoning of her species, a resident of Deck 14, one of the 90 households that had signed the petition, and that she had slipped her parents' grip in the shift-change crowd for the reason children slip their parents' grips, which was that she wanted to see the good neighbor below with her own eyes, and that she had wandered out into the cleared concourse in the confused moments before the beast came down the wall, small and alone, and exactly where no one should have been, and that no adult of any species had reached her in time, because it had all happened in the space of a held breath. She was directly between the beast and the boy. She saw it come. She saw 40 meters of the thing her whole deck whispered about pour down a wall and turn, and come straight at her out of the gold light, silent, enormous, faster than anything she had a word for, and Sesk did what every instinct her small body owned screamed at her to do, what Corrid's whole case had been built upon, the one thing Cal had spent months teaching grown beings never to do in the dark. She ran. She ran the wrong way, blind with terror, not toward her parent, not toward the boy, but sideways across the open concourse in the mindless scatter of a prey animal, a small, fast, bolting shape cutting straight across the path of an apex predator at full speed. And every eye on Coriol Anchorage watched the exact scenario the assessor had named come to terrible life in the bright open air. The child in the corridor who runs, the panicking innocent who moves wrong, the harmless one who trips the killing arithmetic, and there was not one being on that concourse close enough to do anything about it, and Cal Marrow was 30 meters away with his hands empty, too far, far too far, and he did the only thing left to do, which was to trust. "Sit," he said, "just that." Low and even, the child's name for the sitting sky, the word that meant the animal and meant the thing the animal did and meant, most of all, that it should be the thing he had told them it was. "Sit. She's mine. Leave it." The beast was already moving when he said it. Whether it heard the words or read the boys come out of the air or simply was, in the deepest architecture of what it was, a thing that shielded rather than struck, no science the conquered owned would ever be able to say. But this is what 200 beings saw, and what Thren's boards recorded, and what Assessor Vane Corrid witnessed with her own eye cluster from the office door above, and what the record of Coriol anchorage would carry ever after. The child ran, the beast changed. It did not strike the small bolting shape crossing its path. It broke its own arrow-straight line to the boy, the line it had climbed 3 decks and 40 meters of wall to draw, and it curved, all that mass and speed bending in an instant no eye could follow, and it came down not on the child but around her, its enormous gray body folding between the terrified running juvenile and the 8 troopers whose weapons had swung to track her. So that when Cesc stumbled at last and went down in the middle of the concourse, sobbing, small, harmless, she went down in the shadow of the thing, and the thing stood over her, motionless, facing outward, facing the drawn weapons, putting its own body between 200 frightened armed beings and a stranger's child who had run the wrong way. It did not touch her, it never touched her. It stood astride the fallen child in the gold light with its blunt gray head low and level, and its matte dark eyes moving across the ring of leveled weapons. And it was, in that moment, exactly and only what Cal had told the whole station. It was not a hazard checking whether the small thing was worth killing, but an apex that had read a frightened child in a fraction of a second, judged her precisely, correctly, as the most harmless being on the concourse, and made her without instruction. Without its person's hand, the thing it was going to protect. Nobody fired. Later, everyone claimed credit for that, and it belonged to none of them. It belonged to the simple fact that a being cannot pull a trigger while its own mind is busy rearranging everything it believed. 200 souls stood in the gold light and watched the monster of Coriol anchorage shield a sobbing child from them with its own body, and the concourse was so silent that, when Cal Marrow finally moved, the whole station heard his footsteps. He walked, he did not run. He crossed the 30 meters of open concourse at the same unhurried pace he did everything, into the cleared ring, past the frozen troopers, up to the enormous gray shape standing guard over the fallen child, and the beast's head turned to him as he came, and the terrible readiness in it eased, the way a held breath eases, and Cal knelt down in its shadow beside the child. "Hey," he said to her, soft, the same voice for everything. "Hey, you're all right, look at me, you're all right. He wasn't ever going to hurt you, he was keeping the others off you, that's all. That's his whole job, keeping the wrong things off the right ones." He helped the small shaking Orin to her feet, and she clutched at his coveralls, and over her head, 40 centimeters away, the beast lowered its blunt gray skull and with a gentleness that undid every hardened being watching, touched its nose once to the child's trembling shoulder, and then stood and put itself at the boy's side and was still. "There," Cal said, to no one, to everyone, "that's the animal you came to cage." Up at the office door, Assessor Vane Corrid stood with her writ in her hand and did not move for a long time. She was not a being who changed her mind easily. She had told the boy so herself, and it had been true her whole career. But she was, above all the other things she was, honest, and honesty is a discipline that does not care whether the truth is convenient. And she had just watched the exact scenario she had built her entire finding upon: the fleeing child, the panicking innocent, the harmless one who moves wrong in front of the loaded weapon that has decided things, play out in full in the open, at the worst possible moment. With the boy too far away to help and the animal at the absolute limit of the pressure any creature could bear, its person torn from it, its den invaded, hunters all around it, and she had watched the animal, alone, unaided, unsteered, make the choice her findings swore it could not make. Not once, she could have dismissed once. She had said so in the antechamber, and she had been right to, but this was not the controlled trial of a willing aide in a calm room. This was the thing itself, the real scenario, the one that mattered, and the animal had not merely declined to harm the child. It had crossed its own deepest instinct to protect her. A hazard does not do that. A weapon that has decided things does not do that. Only one kind of thing does that, and Corrid had spent her whole career cataloging hazards precisely, so that she would never have to be the being who mistook that one kind of thing for a weapon and put it down. She came down from the office door. She crossed the concourse under the gold light, through the parting frozen crowd, past her own troopers lowering their own weapons without waiting for the order she had not yet given, and she stopped in front of the boy and the child and the beast, and she looked at the animal for a long moment with the whole of her eye cluster, the way she looked at everything, weighing it, and the animal looked back at her with mild dark eyes and did nothing at all. "Technician Marrow," she said at last. Her clean flat voice was not quite as clean as it had been. "I owe you an accounting, and I do not enjoy owing them, so I will make it brief and exact, the way I make everything." She drew herself up. "My finding was that this animal was a lethal uncontained hazard whose good conduct could not be trusted past a single afternoon's observation. I built that finding on a scenario I described to you in this very concourse's antechamber. A child who runs, an innocent who moves wrong, a loaded thing that decides. I have just watched that scenario occur in full, under conditions no trial could have engineered and I would never have dared to, and I have watched the animal answer it in a manner that my finding declared impossible." She turned her eye cluster to the beast, and then back to the boy. "A finding that cannot survive the very scenario it was built upon is not a finding. It is a fear that wrote itself down and called itself procedure. I have spent my career refusing to sign those when other beings brought them to me. I will not sign my own." She reached into her case, and she took out her writ, and she held it a moment in the gold light, and then she keyed it closed and sealed it withdrawn. "The finding is vacated," Assessor Vane Corrid said, loudly enough for the record and the station both. "There will be no removal. Let it be entered that a compliance inspector of the Southern Concord, dispatched to compel the containment of Specimen 6, examined the hazard directly, at some length, under the worst conditions the station could produce, and determined that it had been miscategorized from the beginning, that the creature designated Specimen 6 is not an uncontained hazard but a bonded companion of a resident of this station, whose conduct over 26 months is consistent in every instance with defense and in no instance with predation upon the unoffending, and whose continued residence aboard Coriol Anchorage the Concord finds, on the evidence, to pose no compliance concern. Her mantle plates ticked once. Enter it. And note in the finding that the reviewing officer wishes it recorded that she was wrong, and by how much, so that the next inspector who reads a file about a monster before meeting one will have my error in front of them as a caution." The concourse did not cheer. Cal was grateful for that later. He had braced for a cheer, the ugly relieved roar of a crowd that has watched a spectacle and decided it enjoyed the ending, and it did not come. Instead, 200 beings of 9 species stood under the gold light in a silence that had turned, somewhere in the last few minutes, from terror into something closer to shame. And into that silence the child's parent finally reached her, an Orin dockworker who scooped the sobbing juvenile up in 4 arms and held her and did not, Cal noticed, back away from the beast, but stood there a meter from it, shaking, and looked at the thing that had shielded her daughter and said, in a voice the whole quiet concourse could hear, "Thank you." She was talking to the animal. She was, in the loose way of a being overwhelmed, also talking to the boy, and to the whole strange arrangement, and to 2 years of being wrong about the good neighbor below. The beast looked at her with mild, dark eyes and did the only thing it ever did, which was nothing. And the Orin held her child and wept. And that, a mother thanking a monster, did more to settle the matter on Coriol Anchorage than any writ the Conquered could vacate. Prefect Olaf Sarn stood at the edge of the ring for a long time before he came forward, and when he came to Cal, not to the animal, and he stood in front of the boy with 2 years of grievance sitting badly on his mantle, and he was honest in the end, because the concourse had run out of room for anything else. "I wanted it dead," he said. "For 2 years I wanted it dead. I want you to know that I do not now believe I was entirely wrong to it killed on my station. Whatever the circumstances, beings died in the dark under my authority, and I could not stop it, and I could not find it, and I could not do the one thing my office exists to do, which is keep this ring safe from the things in its walls. And I hated it." He paused. His eye cluster moved to the beast and away. "But I have just watched it do my job better than I have ever done it. It kept the ring safe from the one thing I could not have kept it safe from, which was itself, and it did it by choosing to. I do not understand it. I do not think I am built to understand it. But I will stop trying to kill it, technician, and I will put my office to the work of keeping beings from doing the foolish thing that gets them hurt around it, which appears to be the only kind of harm it has ever caused." He drew himself up, and did the hardest thing a bureaucrat can do, which is amend a doctrine he authored. "The standing order below Deck 12 will be rewritten. Not no solo traffic. We tried fear for 2 years, and it cost us 5 drones a season and the occasional fool on a dare. We will try your rule instead." "My rule," Cal said. "You have said it to half my staff by now. It has come back to me a dozen times." Sarn's mantle plates ticked. "You do not run from what is bigger than you. Running is a language, and the only word it knows is pray. I am told your father taught it to you." He inclined his mantle stiffly, formally. "I would like the station's permission to teach it to everyone." And that was how the Seven Conquered came to codify the first rule of a hard-luck human farm world into the standing safety doctrine of Coriol Anchorage, and how a technician's grandmother's plainest wisdom ended up entered in the station's permanent record under a solemn heading that Cal found so embarrassing he could never afterward say it without wincing. Because the Conquered did not have it in them to simply write down "you do not run," but had to dress it in the gravity of institutions. And so the order that replaced the 2 years of fear below Deck 12 was entered, formally, as standing conduct doctrine, lower warrens, on the discipline of stillness. And every new resident of Coriol Anchorage from that day forward learned it in their first cycle, and most of them never knew it had come off a farm 10,000 light-years away from a young man in his socks who had opened a door. It took the station a while to become the station again. There were reports to file, and Cal filed the ones that were his to file and left the rest to beings with a taste for it. There was a review, and Assessor Corrid conducted it herself before she left, thoroughly, honestly, and entered her error into the record in the exact and unsparing terms she had promised, and it became, in time, a document that other inspectors read, the way she had asked it to be, the finding an official reversed on the evidence of her own eyes, filed as a caution against reading a monster before meeting one. She came to the viewport on her last evening aboard at the quiet hour, and found the boy there with the beast at his feet, and she did not sit, but she stood a while under the gold light. "I have inspected a great many hazards, technician," she said. "I have signed a great many findings. I have never before had one of them thank its own executioner and shield a stranger's child in the same afternoon." She was quiet a moment. "I called you a child in the antechamber. I told you that beings like me exist to make the hard decisions for beings like you. I would like to withdraw that as well, and I find it harder to withdraw than the writ, so I will only say it once. You made the hard decision. You made it the night it knocked, and you made it every day since, and you made it out there in the concourse with your hands empty and a child in its path, and it was harder than any decision my office has ever asked of me, because it had no writ behind it and no armor and no way to be sure you were right, and you made it anyway, and you were right. She inclined her mantle, the fullest bow Cal had ever seen a V-Helk offer. The Concord is poorer at reading its monsters than a farm boy is. I will carry that back with me. Good evening, technician. Good evening, and here she hesitated and looked at the beast and chose, deliberately, the boy's word over the file's number, sit. The beast looked at her with mild dark eyes. He doesn't answer to strangers, Cal said, not unkindly. But he'll remember you didn't shoot. That's most of what he keeps track of in the end. Who came at him and who didn't. Assessor Vane Corrid left Coryall Anchorage the next shift, and she was, by every account that reached Cal afterward, a better inspector for the rest of her career, slower to sign and quicker to go and look. And somewhere in a Concord archive there is a finding with her name on it that begins with the words "I was wrong, and by how much," and young inspectors still read it, and some of them are better for it. And none of them ever learned that the whole thing turned on a grill high in a concourse wall, and a child who ran the wrong way and a monster that chose. Scholar Telm stayed. She had come to Coryall to study a hazard from a distance through the wreckage it left, and she found herself, in the months after, studying something no ith had ever had the chance to study, which was a grief at rest, in the open, in the daily company of the one being it had judged its equal. And she filled a great many records with it, and the records changed the Concord's understanding of the species entirely, and she was generous enough to say, in all of them, that the understanding had cost 26 lives, and near cost a 27th only because no one had thought for 2 years to do the thing the technician did on the first night, which was to answer the door. "I have a question I have wanted to ask you for months," she said to Cal one evening at the viewport, "and I have not asked it because I was not certain you would have an answer, and I have decided that not having an answer would tell me as much as having one." Her small limbs stilled. "It watched this station for 2 years, 80,000 beings, 9 species, every kind of mind the Concord contains, and it chose you, not the strongest, not the cleverest, not the highest ranked. A first-cycle atmospherics technician who warms valves in the cold spur. I have wanted to know, technician, why do you think it was you?" Cal thought about that for a while. It was, he knew, a question a great many beings wanted the answer to, and had wanted since the first night, and had dressed up in cosmic terms. What does it mean that of all the minds in the Concord, an apex predator chose a human? What does it say about humanity? What is it about your species? He had heard the grander versions of the question in the council and the market and the mouths of officials who wanted the arrangement to mean something enormous. "I don't think it's about my species," he said at last. "Everybody keeps wanting it to be about my species. Humans, Deathworlders, apex this and apex that, like he took one look at me and saw a whole planet of dangerous people and decided we were kin." He shook his head. "I don't think he was thinking about humanity at all. I think he was thinking about the technician who kept his den warm and never ran and left him alone, and said thank you when he brought a gift. I don't think he chose a human, Telm. I think he chose the one person on the station who treated him like a neighbor instead of a number, and it happened to be me, and it happened I was human, and those are 2 different facts that everybody keeps gluing together because the glued-together version sounds better in a council." He looked down at the gray shape at his feet. "He didn't pick us because we're the deadliest thing in the galaxy. He picked me because I was the only one who wasn't afraid to be bored around him. That's a lower and truer thing, and I'd rather it stayed lower and truer, if it's all the same to you and your records." Telm was quiet a long moment. "You are aware," she said, "that this is the most humanity-affirming thing anyone has said in any of my records, and that you have said it specifically to prevent me from writing anything humanity-affirming in my records." "Yeah," Cal said, "write that down instead." She did. It is, of all her findings on the grief of Coryall Anchorage, the one most often quoted, and the technician never forgave her for it, and she never regretted it, and that, more or less, was the shape of their friendship for the rest of the time they had. The story got off the station, of course. Stories always do. It went out on the freighters the way everything went out on the freighters, dock crew to dock crew, port to port, growing a little in each telling until the version that reached the far edges of the Concord bore only a passing resemblance to the two quiet beings at the viewport. A version in which the human had tamed a legion of the beasts, or ridden one into battle, or been raised by them on a death world, and sent to the stars as an ambassador of monsters. Cal heard some of the wilder ones come back to him months later off inbound hulls, and found them funny, and corrected none of them, because a man who corrects a good story is a man with too much time. But under the tall tales ran the true one, and the true one was the dangerous one, because the true one carried an idea, and the idea was this: that the deadliest uncontainable thing in the galaxy could be had, not caged, not fought, not conquered, but simply had, kept, made loyal past any leash if you knew the trick. And there is no idea in the whole of the Conquered more certain to make ambitious beings do foolish things than the idea that there is a trick to power, and that someone else has learned it first. So the ports tried. Cal never saw most of it. It reached him only as rumor and eventually as policy. But across the following year, station after station in the Concord's reach acquired, at ruinous expense, an apex specimen of one death world or another. There was a trade in such things, quiet and expensive and now suddenly booming, and installed it, and assigned it a handler, and set out to manufacture what Coriol Anchorage had stumbled into, and the results were, by every account that came back, uniformly catastrophic. And the accounts came back with decreasing frequency, as the stations that had generated them stopped being in a position to file reports. You cannot make a thing choose you by wanting it to. That was the lesson the Concord paid for port by port, in the hard currency it understood least, and it was the lesson Cal could have given them for free, and did give them for free repeatedly, to anyone who asked, in words of one syllable, and no one believed him, because the answer was too plain to be worth what the beasts had cost. Eventually the Concord did the thing the Concord did, which was to convene about it, and to decide that the phenomenon required study and systematization, and to send a formal delegation to Coriol Anchorage to learn the Marrow method. They had named it that, in a memorandum, the Marrow method, and Cal never fully recovered from the indignity, and to bring it home and make of it a program. The delegation was led by a legate named Ossendry, a high Concord official of a species Cal had not met before, tall and grave and draped in the soft gray of an office that answered directly to the core worlds, and the legate arrived with a staff of specialists and a mandate and a great many questions, and found the technician at the viewport at the quiet hour, with the beast at his feet, and sat, and asked the questions. They were good questions. Cal gave them honest answers, and the honest answers were, one after another, not what the legate had crossed half the Concord to hear. How long did the conditioning take? The legate asked. There wasn't any conditioning. The bonding protocol, then, the sequence of contacts, the reinforcement schedule. There wasn't a sequence. It watched me for months and I didn't know it was there, and then it left me a dead rat and I said thank you, and 3 nights later it knocked. That's the whole protocol, legate. I've just given you all of it. It took about 2 years and I wasn't trying and I didn't know I was doing it. The legate's grave face did not change, but the staff behind it exchanged the looks of beings who have traveled a long way to be told there is no map. You are describing an accident, Legate Ossendry said. The Concord cannot build a program on an accident. There must be a method. You did something the other handlers did not. We have lost a great deal, technician. I will be frank. We have lost stations attempting to reproduce your result, and I have been sent to find the variable you controlled that they did not, and I will not accept that the variable was luck, because luck is not a thing I can requisition. Cal looked at the tall, grave being for a while, and then he looked down at the beast, and then he did a thing he rarely did, which was to try, honestly and at length, to explain. "You keep looking for the thing I did," he said. "That's the mistake. That's the same mistake the prefect made and the assessor made and every station that bought a monster and got itself killed made. There isn't a thing I did. There's a thing I didn't do, and it's the hardest thing in the galaxy to not do on purpose, and the second you assign a handler to not do it on purpose, he's already doing it and it's already ruined." He scratched the flat gray skull and it leaned into his palm. "I didn't want anything from him. That's it. That's the whole variable your specialists are looking for. Every handler you sent to every station wanted something, wanted to bond it, wanted to control it, wanted to prove the method worked, wanted to not get killed, wanted to go home a success. And the thing reads intent for a living. It's the best reader of intent your science ever cataloged. You told me so yourselves." So it read every one of those handlers in a fraction of a second, and it saw a being that wanted something from it. And a being that wants something from you is not kin. It's a threat, or a user, or a fool, but it's not kin, and the thing knew that before the handler finished walking into the room. He shook his head. "You can't requisition not wanting anything, Leggett. The moment it's your job to not want something, you want the not wanting, and it can smell that too. The only beings it'll ever choose are the ones who genuinely, all the way down, don't care whether it chooses them, and you can't order a being to genuinely not care. That's the joke your whole program's built on. You're trying to systematize the one thing that stops working the instant it's a system." The Legate was quiet for a long time. "You are telling me," Asindri said at last, "that the Conquered with its fleets, its wealth, its sciences, its whole long reach, cannot buy or build or train what a first-cycle technician acquired by not trying." "I'm telling you the Conquered's got exactly the wrong tools for it," Cal said. "Everything you're good at, the wanting, the building, the trying, the systematizing, is the specific thing that makes it not happen. You're the strongest thing in the galaxy, and you're standing in front of the one prize your strength can't take, because the prize only goes to whoever's not reaching for it. That's not a humiliation, Leggett. It's just a category you don't have a folder for. Some things you can only have by not grasping, and the Conquered's never once in its history had to not grasp anything, so it never learned how, so it can't, and there's a monster asleep on a farm boy's feet to prove it." He paused and softened it, because the Legate had come a long way and meant well, and the truth had been hard enough. "For what it's worth, if you really want the program to work, disband it. Tell every station to stop buying beasts and stop assigning handlers, and just let the things be, warm and left alone in the dark, asking nothing. And in about 2 years, on maybe one station in 50, some cook or clerk or technician who never got the memo will finish warming a valve, and there'll be a knock. You can't make it happen. You can only stop making it not happen, and then get out of the way and wait." Legate Asindri went home with no method, no program, and a report that recommended, to the astonishment of the core worlds, that the Conquered's entire Apex Companion initiative be dissolved, and its acquired beasts released to warm dens and benign neglect. And the recommendation was so strange and so plainly correct that it was, after the usual convening, adopted, and the trade in Deathworld apexes collapsed, and here and there across the following years, on this station and that, quietly. Unrequested, unsystematized, a being who wanted nothing finished a small task in the dark and heard, low on the hatch, a patient beat and a beat and a beat. It never happened often, it was never supposed to. But it happened more than it would have, because one technician on one-way station had answered a door, and told the truth about it afterward to anyone who asked, and the truth had turned out to be the only method there was, which was no method at all. The station learned to live with its good neighbor, which is to say the station forgot, in the ordinary way, that there had ever been anything to learn. That was the part that would have astonished Cal most, if he had been a being given to astonishment, which he was not. Within a season, the gray shape padding at the technician's heel down the concourse was no longer a spectacle. The markets did not empty for it. The traders nodded to the boy and went back to their haggling, and once memorably, an old Vhelk spice seller who had closed his stall in terror. The first time the boy walked past reached out, unthinking, and dropped a scrap of dried river eel toward the beast as it went by, the way you toss a treat to a shopkeeper's dog, and then froze in horror at his own hand. And the beast caught the scrap out of the air without breaking stride, and ate it and went on. And the spice seller laughed the high, hysterical laugh of a being who has survived his own foolishness. And after that, a great many stalls kept a scrap of something by the register, just in case, and the good neighbor below grew, over the seasons, faintly and disgracefully spoiled. Cal disapproved of it and could not stop it. "You'll make him fat," he told the concourse generally, and the concourse ignored him, because a station that has decided to love a thing will feed it, and there is no doctrine against that, though Cal several times threatened to write one. The new arrivals were the only ones who ever forgot. Green dock hands off the freighters, cadets fresh from some inner-world academy, brokers who had not heard the story. They would come around a corner of the concourse and meet the gray shape padding toward them and do the ancient foolish thing, freeze and then bolt, and the whole market would wince. And Cal would say, unhurried, without even looking up, "Stand still." And 9 times in 10 the new arrival would obey a stranger's voice out of pure animal relief at being told what to do. And the beast would pass them without a glance, and they would learn the rule in a single lesson they never afterward needed repeated. The 10th one ran. The beast never touched them either. It only watched them go, the way you watch a thing that has failed a very simple test, and Cal would sigh and go find them shaking behind a stall and explain, patiently, for the 100th time, that running was a language and they had just said the only word it knew, and that they were lucky the good neighbor below had long since stopped listening to it. The child Cesc came to find them nearly every off-shift. She had gotten over her terror completely, in the total way of the very young, and replaced it with a proprietary devotion that Cal found equal parts touching and exhausting. She had decided that the beast had chosen to protect her personally, out of all the beings on the concourse, which was not untrue, and that this made them, in some sense she could not articulate and would not be argued out of, family. She would sit at the viewport with her small back against the enormous gray flank, 4 limbs folded, and tell the animal about her day in a piping unbroken stream, and the beast would lie with its chin on its paws and let her, and Cal would sit nearby and pretend to read a manifest and watch the 2 of them out of the corner of his eye, and think that his father would have understood this, the small, loud thing safe against the enormous, quiet one. Even if his father would never in 100 years have believed the rest of it. "He likes me best," Cesc informed Cal once, with the serene certainty of the very small. "He tolerates you best," Cal corrected. "There's a difference. He likes me best. You he tolerates, which for him is practically a declaration." "What's the difference?" Cal considered how to explain, to a 7-year-old, the architecture of an apex predator's regard. "He'd cross a room for you," he said finally. "He'd cross the galaxy for me. Tolerating's crossing a room, liking's the other thing." He watched her digest this. "Don't feel bad. Crossing a room is a lot from him. He wouldn't cross the concourse for the whole rest of the station put together." Cesc thought about it, and evidently found it satisfactory, and leaned back against the gray flank, and went on telling the beast about her day, and the beast let her, and that was crossing a room, and it was, from the hollow of Coriol anchorage, a very great deal. Voss came down to the cold spur, sometimes off the roster still, though no longer in armor. He had made a strange sort of peace with the thing that killed his war beasts, the peace of a professional who has finally met a master of his own trade, and decided that grief and respect could share a room. He would sit at the junction 9 elbow while Cal worked, at the respectful body length that had become, between the 3 of them, a kind of courtesy, and he would watch the beast, and once he said, "I bred war beasts my whole life. Selected for loyalty, for aggression, for the thing that makes a hound go into the dark on a leash and die there because you told it to. I got very good at it, and I never once made anything like that." He nodded at the gray shape. because you cannot breed for it. It is not loyalty. Loyalty is a leash you put on from the outside. That, he searched for it. That is a choice it made from the inside and keeps making every day freely and could stop making any time it liked and does not. I spent my life manufacturing the cheap version of the thing that walked up to your door and asked. He was quiet. I think that is why the prefect could never cage it and I could never kill it. You cannot take away by force a thing that is only there by choice. It was never ours to remove. It was only ever the technician's to keep, because it was only ever the technician it gave itself to. You could have it, Cal said mildly. The choosing. It's not a human thing. Telns got it wrong and I keep telling her. Anybody could have had this. You just have had to be boring at it for 2 years first and not shoot. Voss made the low drail rumble that passed for a laugh. No, he said. I would have shot, I know myself. That is the whole difference, technician, and it is not a small one, and it is not about your species, and it is not about mine. Some beings, when the dark looks at them, reach for a weapon, and some beings finish warming the valve. He rose, an avalanche standing up. I reach for the weapon. I have made my peace with it, but I am glad on this station that there was one being who did not, and I am glad it was down here in the cold where nobody was watching, so that it was real and not a performance. He looked at the beast a last time. Keep it warm, he said, which was, from a Drael beastmaster, the tenderest possible farewell, and he went back up to his kennels and his cheap manufactured loyalty. And he was, everyone agreed, gentler with the war beasts after, and kept them off the leash more and lost fewer. Steward Ossiel made a point in the seasons after of taking his own quiet hour at the viewport, and more often than not he found the technician already there, and the beast, and the three of them fell into the habit of sitting together under the gold light with nothing much to say, which suited all of them. Ossiel had been the first to warn the boy, on that same bench, that the thing in the walls had not finished looking, and he had been right. And he took a dry administrator's satisfaction in having been right about a thing that turned out well, which he confided was a rarer pleasure in his line of work than anyone imagined. I told you it was deciding something about you, he said once. I meant it as a warning. Cal said that most of the true things people told him had been meant as warnings, and that he had stopped being able to tell the warnings from the blessings a while back. And Ossiel ticked his mantle plates in the V-Helk way that meant he had heard something worth keeping, and did not argue, because down at their feet the proof of it lay gray and enormous and at rest, and there was nothing left in the matter to warn anyone about. Watch Officer Thren drew the late monitor shift on the anniversary, though she did not mark it as an anniversary until she was already in the chair. 2 years and some months since she had sat in this same suite and logged the loss of a drone at Junction 9, and written location unknown, intent unknown, recommend no pursuit, and been wrong about one of the three and not learned how wrong for 11 days. She had the lower Warren boards up out of habit, the boards that had been her whole trade, and she watched them the way she had watched them for 6 cycles, reading the station like a tide line. There was sound in the Warrens again. That was the thing she noticed, the thing that made her sit back in the chair and understand, all at once, that the long story she had opened was truly over. For 2 years the low Warrens had been a held breath, the hollow silence that fell before the thing moved, the flat audio bars, the dark she had learned to dread. And now the boards ticked along with ordinary noise, coolant and atmospherics and the small pale scavengers that would never fully leave a station, and threaded through all of it, on the Deck 14 board, a single warm gold track lying still beside a slightly cooler one, in a small box of quarters, breathing in the one slow rhythm that had once been the most frightening thing in the monitoring suite, and was now, to Thren, the most reassuring reading on her entire console. The vents were quiet, but it was a different quiet. 2 years ago the Warrens had gone quiet because something in them was hunting. Now they were quiet because the thing that had hunted them had a warm floor to sleep on, and a person to sleep near, and no reason left to move through the dark at all. And the difference between those two silences was the whole distance the station had traveled, and Thren was the only being aboard whose trade let her hear it. She did not log anything. There was nothing to log. For the first time in her memory, the low-Warren boards had, across an entire shift, absolutely nothing to report, and she sat in the quiet suite and looked at the peaceful gold track on the Deck 14 board and let herself, just once, off the record, feel the thing she had not let herself feel in 2 years of writing Recommend No Pursuit, which was glad. Then she wrote, in the notes field, the only entry the shift required, and it was not the entry she had written for 2 years, and she took a private and enormous satisfaction in the difference. Warren's nominal, all quiet, no pursuit necessary. She keyed it and leaned back, and watched the gold light of Vantith crawl slow and enormous across the great viewport, and let the good quiet hold. Cal Marrow still worked the cold spur. They had offered him better. After the concourse, after the finding was vacated, after the station decided it loved him, there had been offers, a supervisor's post, a transfer to the good decks, a rank in an office, and an end to crawling around in the bones of the station at odd hours. He had turned them all down, politely, the way he turned down most things, and gone back to his run, 14 through 19, the cold spur, because somebody had to keep the air moving down there, and because he did not mind, and because the beast liked it, and because a young man who has found the exact shape of his own life is a fool to let anyone talk him into a different one. So he warmed valves in the cold, and he hummed his grandmother's tune with no words in the dark, and the gray shape lay a body length off and watched him work, and kept the wrong things off the right ones, and the two of them made their small human and not human sounds in the deep quiet of the station's lungs. And it was, by any reckoning Cal cared about, a good life. At the end of shift he would sit in the corridor with his back against the cold plate the way he had the first night, and the beast would come and lie down beside him, and put its blunt gray head across his knees, a weight like a fallen beam, warm through the fabric, and Cal would rest his hand on the flat ash-colored skull and feel it lean, a fraction into his palm, and they would sit there a while in the dark before going home, the sitting sky and the still small human, neither of them speaking. Because neither of them ever had, because the whole thing had never once been about words. He thought sometimes about the knock. He could not help it. It was the hinge his whole life had turned on, and a man returns to a hinge. He thought about the 3 deliberate impacts low on the hatch, patient, a beat and a beat and a beat, the sound of something that could have come through the door choosing instead to touch it, the sound of the deadliest thing on the station standing in the corridor of his home, working up the nerve, after 2 years of watching, to ask. Everyone always wanted to know why it had chosen him. He never had a better answer than the one he gave Telm, and he stopped trying to find one, because the truth was small and plain, and he had made his peace with small and plain a long time ago. It had watched the whole station, and it had found one being who kept its den warm and never ran and said thank you for a gift he hadn't asked for, and it had knocked. That was all. That was everything. The great head grew heavy on his knees. In the dark of the cold spur the beast that no cage had held and no weapon had moved and no writ had removed let its dark eyes drift half-closed, safe, at rest, sitting, and its breathing slowed. And after a while Cal slowed to match it without his deciding to, the way it always did, the way it had that first night on the monitoring boards 300 meters up, and would have horrified anyone watching, and there was no one watching, and it horrified no one. "All right," Cal said quietly to the dark, to the animal, to the warm weight on his knees. "All right, 10 more minutes, then home." The beast did not move. It had crossed the galaxy for him once, 3 decks and 40 meters of wall in the space of a held breath, and it would again, without a sound, the instant he needed it. But he did not need it. He only needed it to sit in the warm dark at the end of a long shift, and it was very good at that, and so was he, and so they did together, the sitting sky and the boy who had answered the door. 10 more minutes, and then they went home,